Where your love has always been enough, for me, classicequinox, it's worse than the report had claimed. There's at least 50 Nomu. Fighting against one had already left Enji in a hospital bed with grievous injuries. Even with the both of them, even if it turns out these Nomu aren't the advanced versions, there's no guarantee the fight will turn out in their favor. The grim truth of the matter is that this isn't a fight for victory. It's a fight for time. I'm the only one in the area with enough firepower to delay them. Enji states firmly. No, you're not. Xiaotou growls, referring to himself. Strictly speaking, that is true, but they cannot afford to delay the backup requested for the main battle downtown. You were specifically requested for. Your friends need your help. Enji isn't going to compromise on this, and he isn't above blatant manipulation. He isn't going to let any kid, let alone Xiaotou, stay here to face an army of Nomu, and they can't both. I will delay them for as long as I am able. The other pro heroes in the area will be dispatched to their designated locations as planned. Send back up to me only if they can be spared. There's a long, terrible moment where Xiaotou glares at him, looking like he's about to argue. But then, he snaps his mouth shut and nods, a mechanical jerk of his head. His fists are clenched, and Enji doesn't know what to say. There's no protocol on how to deal with this sort of situation. Even if there were, it probably wouldn't have applied. He's made sure of that. Stay safe. Give Fuyumi, Natsuo, and your mother my regards. Enji mutters gruffly. And my apologies. He knows it's too little, too late, but it's all he can give them. Don't be stupid. Tell them yourself. Xiaotou chokes out, his voice thicker and rougher than Enji has ever heard. Enji nods once, terse and perfunctory. His first white lie, and an utterly ineffective one. They both know he won't be coming back. There are no gushy platitudes of don't do it, no attempt at a hug, or even a pat on the back. They, or their relationship, it's hard to tell the difference, are too damaged for that. They both hesitate, nonetheless, a sense that they shouldn't just leave things hanging like this. But then, there's a sudden crack of a distant volley of explosions, and the moment passes. Xiaotou turns away first. He sends one wave of his flames toward the incoming horde, then sprints away on a path of his mother's ice, a shock of red and white. He doesn't look back. It's probably for the best. I'm proud of you. Enji realizes abruptly, once Xiaotou is gone, is what he should have said, even if Xiaotou doesn't care. But he's no stranger to missed opportunities, and there's no time for regrets. He swallows the lump in his throat, now, of all times, really. And turns back to face the Nomu steadily advancing towards him. Enji squares his shoulders and steels himself, preparing for the fight for his life. It's disgusting that of all ways to step down from the mantle of number one hero, he's going to be, once again, emulating All Might's final act. Except, unlike All Might, he isn't taking down the final boss. He's merely handling the distraction. He'll have to trust that the newly minted pro heroes, they're all still so young, and the older veterans alike can win their battles. If they defeat Shigaraki and All for One, his death won't be in vain, the boost to public morale will outweigh the hit from the death of the number one hero. He has to have faith in that, if nothing else. The first wave of Nomu leap at him, and then there's no time to think. It's a blur of red, an endless mix of fire and rage, BLD and pain. He takes down at least 10 and injures up to half of them, he thinks, before he reaches his limit, coughing BLD out from his lungs, barely being able to stand. He doesn't know how long it's been, if he's done enough, if he's failed everyone. But he doesn't have a choice but to keep going, and hope it is. He lets out a roar, igniting himself in a tower of flames burning hotter and brighter than he's ever managed, the flames spiraling up a luminous blue around him, burning him too. 2 ears flames, Enji thinks, allowing himself a bloody grin as it takes down a few more of the BSTRDS still brainlessly clawing at him. Not bad for a last hurrah. He can still hear screaming in the background, the sound of helicopters in the air above him. He's vaguely aware that someone seems to be running towards him, but that can't be right. The searing pain in Enji's chest intensifies. Tell them yourself. He takes in a shaky breath. It mixes with BLD and rattles in his chest. His eyelids are heavy and he can't keep them from fluttering shut. This isn't going to work. Sorry, Shouto. Maybe next time. The cloud of fog in his mind grows, and slowly, the ringing in his ears fades. At least, he thinks, they will get along just fine without him. It's a bittersweet thought, but it's not one he's going to have to contemplate for long. Enji draws in one last breath, then welcomes the darkness that swallows him. Smoke, fire, flames that flicker red and blue. Cherry blossoms, frost on the window panes, a vase full of amaryllises. Anger, shouting, boiling water. A psychiatric ward, a school, a gravestone. Enji wakes up with his heart pounding in his chest. He gasps, his lungs drawing in air greedily. He can breathe. It doesn't hurt. Nothing hurts, except for his throat. He forcibly modulates his breathing, something drummed into him since early days of becoming a pro-hero, then blinks, letting his vision get acclimatized to the dim lighting. Enji recognizes this ceiling. He survived. No, that's impossible. Why would he be in his room instead of a hospital ward? There's a light pressure on his arm, a hand, he realizes. He turns to his right, then stops short. She shouldn't be here. He blinks again, but she's still there. Only. We woke you up because you were screaming in your sleep. It's colored with worry and apology, but Enji would recognize the soft, melodic cadences of her voice anywhere. It is Rei. And she looks far younger than she should be, barely a day over 24. He realizes belatedly, only when a young boy, Tuya, clambers up onto the bed clumsily, then pulls at Enji's arm. If this is a dying hallucination, it's a strange one. Why would he dream up a scene set in a time where none of the rest of his children even exist? Are you hurt? Tuya asks, his voice high and face scrunched up in worry, the bright blue eyes staring at him a reflection of his own. 3-year-old Tuya, Enji thinks numbly. It's both easy and anything but to look at him and think of Darby, wreathed in blue flames and covered in scars. No. He answers past the lump in his throat, not trusting himself to say anything more. Tuya, this tiny version of him that Enji has tried so hard to forget for the sake of his sanity, peers at him and nearly falls on him, forcing Enji to support him. He awkwardly pats Tuya on the back, then turns to Rei, who interprets it as a call for help. Daddy's okay, let's go get you back to sleep so he can rest too. Rei expertly coaxes Tuya back into her arms. Tuya yawns, as if to prove her point, and lets his mother pick him up. Good night, Daddy. Tuya announces. Good night, Tuya. Enji replies after a beat. It comes out thicker than he meant it to, and Rei twists back to look at him, confusion written in the worried tilt of her eyebrows. She leaves the door open. Enji exhales slowly, reaching for a phone on the bedside table. He can't decide if he wants to be there or not. His fingers close around metal, and there it is, an outdated model he'd long abandoned in favor of newer technology. He unlocks it, wincing at the glare of the screen, then looks at the date. It's as he thought. Enji is quite sure that deathbed dreams don't last so long, and shouldn't be so realistic as to even include time-PRD-appropriate background props. He raises a hand to touch the side of his face. There's smooth, unblemished skin where a scar should be. He lets out a shuddering breath. Everything points to one logical conclusion, but how can this be? A latent quirk manifestation. He doesn't understand. There's a natural order to life. People live, then die. They don't live, then die, then get mentally thrown back into the past to live again. That's not how life works. There's movement in the doorway that Enji catches out of the corner of his eye. He turns to face it, watching as Rei walks in, carrying a glass of water. This time, without a tiny boy launching himself at Enji, he takes a moment to just look at his wife. He hasn't seen her in so long. It's the same white hair, the same grey eyes. But she's still so young, and with the benefit, curse, of hindsight, Enji can spot the differences, the crucial ones. She doesn't walk like she's trying to shrink into herself, she doesn't drop her gaze to the ground the very moment their eyes meet. Somehow, even though her hair is tangled and there are bags under her eyes, she looks far healthier, far more alive. She looks appealing. And then, he'd burnt her out. Enji closes his eyes, letting out a shaky breath. He'd thought he would never see her again. It feels like cheating, somehow, to get this chance. By the time he opens them again, the glass is on the bedside table, and Rei is next to him, barely 30 centimeters away. She reaches a hand out towards him, a hesitant, uncertain motion. Enji doesn't move, doesn't speak, just keeps his eyes trained on hers. There's still flecks of confusion amidst the worry in her gaze, and something tender underneath that makes him look away. Her fingers brush against his cheek, catching a tear he hadn't known had fallen. It's a gentle, barely there touch. It shouldn't be able to cause such a powerful pang in his chest. Enji? Rei asks softly, drawing him out of his head. It's been a decade since he last heard her say his name, but he remembers, and the duality of losing and regaining seizes in his throat. He probably couldn't speak if he wanted to. With the way he's acting, she must think that he has gone insane. When Rei withdraws her hand, Enji catches her wrist. She stiffens, an almost imperceptible tensing of her shoulders, and something in his heart clenches. He loosens his grip, needing her to know she has the choice, but she doesn't let go. She doesn't wrench her hand away when he gently brings her wrist to his lips, she doesn't recoil when he lightly kisses the underside of her wrist. They stay like that for a few long moments, just the sound of their breaths in the air between them. It's a selfish moment of escape, and it takes a while before he musters the strength to speak. It was a nightmare, Enji says quietly. His voice is rough from its apparently recent abuse, yet much less gruff than it will grow into with age. He lifts his gaze back up to meet Rei's, watching as surprise flashes through her eyes. About our family. In a move of surprising boldness, Rei perches on the bed next to him, then threads her fingers through his. He can't help his weakness, no, he's not going to think of it as that anymore, the flutter of warmth in his chest at the simple initiation of contact. It's a strange mix of unfamiliar and home, and it gives him the push he needs to continue with his narration. I dreamt of us, decades in the future. He murmurs. It doesn't feel right dismissing an entire life he's led as a dream, but he needs to get it out, to prove to himself it happened, and how else could he ever describe it? Tuya manifested a flame quirk like mine. I trained him every day, subjecting him to a Spartan regime. I was pushing him to his limits, and beyond them. You asked me to stop, his voice cracks. How mortifying. But Rei doesn't comment, and so he continues. But I didn't listen. And eventually, he snapped and ran away. When I next heard from him, he'd become a villain. Not a petty criminal, but an established one. Where was I throughout all of this? Rei asks, her voice surprisingly strong. Enji clenches his free hand, fighting to keep a torrent of anger, disgust, hatred at bay. Rei's thumb starts drawing circles on his palm, a slow and tentative motion. Once upon a time, he would have interpreted it as patronizing, and the sheer presumption of the action would have been enough of a trigger to set him off. Now, it still isn't soothing per se, but it helps to ground him, helps him to draw in a slow breath, and he can appreciate the thought behind it. In a psychiatric ward. Enji answers hollowly. You threw a kettle of boiling water at Tuya when he was a little older, because he reminded you of me. He pauses, forcibly unclenching his fist. You would get panic attacks in my presence, so the doctors recommended we did not meet. We didn't see each other for the next 10 years. There's a beat of silence at that, and the motion of Rei's thumb stills. I'm here, and perfectly sane, Rei begins haltingly. And have you seen Tuya? She pauses, evidently unsure how to continue, because the problem there had always been Enji, not Tuya. An uncomfortable silence falls upon them, because they both know the truth, that maybe not yet, but at the rate he's going, he could push them off the edge. There's an ugly part of him that hates her for acknowledging it, and a growing part of him that's all the more disgusted at himself. It's a dark coil of anger deep in the pit of his stomach, reminding him that he was the root, the catalyst, the trigger for their family's downward spiral. It did happen, he reminds himself harshly. He can't forget that, even if time has actually reset itself. In some ways, it's harder to force himself to look Rei in the eyes than to battle 50 Nomu. But he does, because he refuses to be a coward, and he owes her that much, at least. No, I haven't. Because I haven't been around the two of you enough. He admits, his tone low and confessional. A breath hitches in Rei's throat. She makes to say something, but Enji cuts her off, for the last time, he promises, before he loses the nerve to say what needs to be said. I've been a terrible husband and father. Enji says plainly, the words coming out in a rush. His lips curve up into a bitter smile. I know I'm not good with emotions. I've never known how to be anything else. But I've seen where that leads, Anne. I don't want to be that anymore. His words and DLVRY are embarrassingly clumsy, but he forces himself to plow through. I know that I've hurt you, many times over, and for that. Enji pauses, taking a deep breath, feeling deeply outside his comfort zone. I apologize. For that, and everything worse that I've done that you don't remember. I might not deserve another chance, but I hope you'll give me one, and help me to be better. Stop me when I go overboard, tell me when, if I scare you, and I'll try to listen. He finishes his plea, because it somehow turned into one, rough and stumbling and uncertain. Rei's eyes are wide. The expression on her face is one he can't decipher. She could have been carved from ice, the way she's still as a statue and hasn't said anything. Enji's lungs constrict. Perhaps he's already too late, maybe she doesn't want to try. His thoughts cut off abruptly when Rei all but launches herself at him, burying her face in the crook of his neck. For a few moments, he just sits there like a fool until his brain catches up and his arms slowly jerk upward to hold her in an embrace. It's a bucket of cold water poured over his head, the realization that in the past decades, he's held more strangers in his arms than he has his wife, and it's probably true even in this era of his life. Rei's skin is cool to the touch, more so than is strictly comfortable, but she's wonderfully solid and present. He can't help closing his eyes and leaning into the touch, savoring the simple miracle that she's here, that he's here. He breathes in the scent of her hair. Floral, he thinks, fondness tinged with a sort of hysterical edge, of course. He only realizes that she's crying when he feels a patch of dampness growing on his shoulder, through his shirt. What's wrong? Enji asks, half alarmed, and half darkly wondering if even in trying to fix things, he's already managed to mess up. Nothing. Comes the muffled reply, before Rei looks up and pulls away. The corners of her lips quirk up into a smile. It isn't particularly wide, more measured hope than happiness, but it transforms her face regardless, making her look radiant. That's my answer to your previous question as well. She adds, soft yet sure, and a crushing pressure in Enji's chest, one that he hadn't known was there, lightens. He blames it on shock at his potential unique circumstances and the emotional rollercoaster that his last 3 hours have been that words fail him yet again. Instead, he gives in to the urge to lean down, pressing a soft kiss on her forehead. He lets his lips linger for a few moments, trying to convey all that he can't properly verbalize. Rei looks back at him, countless questions in her silver-grey eyes. We should sleep. Enji says, partly because it's true, he's physically exhausted, emotionally drained, and not entirely convinced all of this isn't a figment of his imagination, and partly because he doesn't think he can answer all of her questions, and the last thing he wants is to ruin their current fragile understanding. He promptly regrets it when Rei nods, her expression closes off, and she makes to get off the bed. They had always maintained separate living quarters in the name of privacy, but it feels wrong, somehow, for this to end with them going their separate ways, as if nothing had happened. Will you stay the night? Enji asks, almost impulsively, before he can second-guess his own request. Rei's eyes widen. They've never done this, them sleeping together with her in his bed instead of him in hers. He'd never asked before he did, they've never done it for the sake of it without coupling beforehand. But what he's just told her, he means it. He needs her to know that he does, that he's going to try his best to be better. His endeavor and his best is definitely more than just good enough, more than just avoiding his own personal pitfalls. Rei hesitates for a moment, then nods, a small smile on her face. Let me check on Tuya first. I'll go get my things. What's between them is tenuous, frayed, but it's not broken. Not yet. In another lifetime, Enji had cut the strings, had pushed away everyone he deemed superfluous in his single-minded pursuit of number one. He had lost sight of everything else that mattered while hurtling toward something only he could see. And in the end, he'd got what he wanted, the last way he'd ever wanted it. There had been nothing waiting for him at the top, no one to celebrate it with. Only the weight of the world on his shoulders and large footprints to fill. This time, he doesn't want to walk down that same path. Hell, he doesn't even need to be number one, not really, not anymore. His mind conjures up a memory of Xiaotou, of a conversation he will never forget. It's, as he said back then. He just wants to be a hero that his children, and his wife, can be proud of. A good husband, a good father, someone that his family deserves, someone who can love and be loved. Tuya doesn't have to be driven to villainy, nor Rei to the brink of insanity. When they're born, Fuyumi and Natsuo shouldn't have to grow up feeling neglected and unloved, Xiaotou shouldn't have to hate an entire half of himself. Enji doesn't need to see hatred, pain, fear or indifference in their eyes whenever they look at him. Rei comes in for the third time. It's just as well that tomorrow is a Sunday. He helps her slip under the blanket, and she smiles at him, uncertain but true. He hates that he can't remember the last time she smiled so much in his presence. He can't quite bring himself to smile back at her, but if this is real, if there is a tomorrow, he swears that one day, he will. Enji lightly rests a leg against Rei's, and she shifts closer to cement the touch. It's barely anything, but it's much more than he's ever had, than he's ever let either of them have, and so, it's enough. It's enough that she can bear looking at him, that being in the same room as him doesn't cause her to panic. If all of this is just a dying hallucination to earn some semblance of peace, it's enough. Rei doesn't sleep, even when Enji drifts off, the furrow between his brows smoothing out when he eventually does. Her heart has finally stopped hammering in her chest, sent into overdrive by a potent mixture of disbelief and hope. She can't shake off the feeling that maybe she had stepped into an alternate universe 1 hour ago, when she'd first entered his room to find him screaming. The thing is, Rei knows her husband. Before everything that had just happened, she would have been steadfast in her certainty that Todoroki Enji is cold, formal and distant. He doesn't do soft. He doesn't show vulnerability or weakness. He doesn't look at her like he treasures her, giving her kisses on her forehead and wrist that are so sweet they make her heart ache. With the way he's been recently, she would never have suspected him to have those fears he'd just described. For the last 2 years, the only emotions she's really seen from him are variations on anger. There's a whole spectrum there that she's familiar with, everything from annoyance to fury. He's never physically hit her, but his words can be cutting, and there are times when she's scared. You would get panic attacks in my presence. It hadn't always been like that. Back at the beginning, he'd been aloof and gruff, but still kind. He'd asked about Rei's favorite flower and her pastimes, she'd learnt about his aspirations and his past. They had actually spent time together, doing things that couples usually do, watching the sakura bloom, ringing in the new year with a kiss. She'd thought she could learn to love him, and for a while, she thinks that she actually did. But as he grew busier with hero work and Tuya came into the picture, all of that had gradually stopped. His temper grew shorter as the years went by, and with it, any hopes of their arranged marriage ever turning out to be anything more. Then came tonight. Rei wants this for herself, for her son, this glimpse of what could be that she's seen in the past hour, so much that it hurts. She doesn't understand it, though. It doesn't make sense. No pro-hero is a stranger to nightmares, let alone Enji, whose high power quirk lends itself to dire situations with unavoidable casualties. Even so, he has never talked about them, has never let her see anything behind his self-irked wall. He's never screamed during one, loud enough to wake both Tuya and her. And then, they'd woken Enji up, and he'd acted even more strangely. Instead of simply claiming he was fine and then sending them off, he had stared at Rei as if he couldn't believe she was there, then let Tuya climb onto his bed and cling to him. There had been unshed tears in his eyes, an unexplainable amalgamation of relief and sorrow, and that had been the confirmation for her that something was wrong. So, she'd tucked Tuya back into bed, assuring him she was going to help Enji, and now, here she is. It all just feels so surreal. She wouldn't be surprised if she woke up in the morning only to find herself in her own bed, all of this turning out to be a dream. As if he knows the direction her thoughts are going, Enji shifts in his sleep. There's a loss of contact for a moment, and then his chest is there, a very warm and very real pressure against her back. It's new, but not entirely unfamiliar, and is decidedly comfortable. That night, Rei lets herself fall asleep with a smile on her face. Chapter 2 this time, waking up is not so much a jolt to life as a gradual growth of awareness, Enji's senses firing on one by one. There's a light pressure against his chest, the warm brush of skin on skin, a ticklish sensation on his cheek. He could get used to this, if he let himself, and something about that makes Enji irrationally reluctant to open his eyes. It's hard to decide which would be worse, for this to be real, or not. When Enji finally does lift his eyelids, he's greeted by the sight of white hair. One of his arms is strewn across Rei's waist, holding her loosely to him. He exhales slowly. It's real. He's alive. He's in the past. What now? He had never asked for forgiveness, let alone a second chance. The consequences of his actions, or inaction, decades in the making, had always been something he was prepared to live with. What-ifs and a what-could-have-beens had no place in his life, not even in the dark recesses of his thoughts. Such speculation could only be pointless. Painful. That said, he's not enough of a fool to walk the same failed path twice. The question of where to start, what to fix, is much harder to tackle. But he'd promised, last night, to try. And by some slide of miracle, the word makes his lips curl, but he's hard-pressed to offer any alternative explanation. He can. Something dangerously close to anticipation bubbles in his chest. Enji lifts his arm, as gently as he can, and carefully extricates himself from the bed. Luckily, Rei doesn't awaken. She only shifts in response, burrowing her head deeper into her pillow, looking far more serene and comfortable than she really should be. He looks away. Washing up at the toilet is another challenge in itself. Enji thought he'd mentally prepared himself, but knowing isn't the same as seeing, and he can't help the sense of disconnection when he looks up from the sink. Xiaotou will remain similarly unmarked. He leaves the room, mental state still stuck somewhere in cloudy disbelief, and nearly kicks Tuya, who is perched right outside his room. It's easier that Tuya still has a shock of red hair instead of black, that the age difference between what Enji remembers and what is in front of him is so wide. Yet, it also makes contemplating everything that happened in between much more sobering. Tuya, for his part, recovers from the shock of his near injury far faster than Enji does. Mummy isn't there. Tuya points in the general direction of her room, then adds plaintively. I'm hungry. You shouldn't sit here. It's dangerous. Enji says, almost on autopilot, defaulting to the black and white of facts. We could hit you by accident. But you won't, right? Tuya blinks up at him, eyes wide and trusting, and there's a momentary pang in Enji's chest. Past tense, future tense, yes and no. He'd held back, of course, but even then no. Enji eventually says. Not this time. Even if he somehow ends up training Tuya again, for control instead of power. It's a train of thought that Enji needs a strong coffee to pursue. Breakfast sounds like a good idea. Your mother is still sleeping. Enji continues, pointing out the obvious. He presses his lips together. He doesn't trust himself to prepare the traditional breakfasts that Rei, and after that, Fuyumi, WHPS up. I'll make us toast and spread. You're cooking? Tuya asks, eyes as wide as saucers. It's just bread and butter. Enji says, almost defensively. He's confident of that much, late nights and missed dinners have made sure of that. Tuya scrunches his nose. I don't like butter. Does he not? Enji had always thought himself observant, and it's only just begun to strike him just how much he had missed the first time around. Or rather, Enji admits, he'd just never cared enough to look. That thought makes him swallow his instinctual response of beggars can't be choosers. Cheese. Enji finds himself offering instead. He hopes there's actually some in the fridge. Tuya nods enthusiastically. How had he become Darby, and makes a beeline for the kitchen. Enji hesitates for a moment, then follows after his son at a more measured pace, closing the gap easily with his larger strides. Whoever claimed that it was never too late to start had been wrong, is possibly right, and for once, Enji is completely fine with not having the last laugh. Enji absolutely does not lose to a toaster. It's just more expedient and precise to use his flames. Ray wakes up in an empty bed. But it's the right one, and that makes a world of difference. The sliding door isn't fully closed. If she concentrates, she can hear snippets of conversation drifting in from outside, a gruff baritone interspersed by high-pitched interjections of why and why not. Alarm bells start ringing in Ray's head, but there's no crescendo of exasperated answers leading to a shout for silence, and so, Ray lies back down, blinking, her chest warm in a way it hasn't been for a while. Last night hadn't been a dream. And maybe it's too early to say, but Enji seems to have meant it. She's content to simply lay there for a little longer. It's only when Ray swears she hears her husband warn Tuya that using fire to melt cheese is usually a bad idea, especially without his level of control, that she decides it's time to intervene. Enji's office at the agency is how it's always been for the most of his career. Large room, his desk, 2 shelves behind him, slowly filling up with case folders and reference books. It's never really felt oppressive before. He's always preferred empty space to unnecessary opulence. The set of couches he'd eventually commissioned, and keeps expecting to see whenever he looks up, had been born out of functional need. With the whole situation with All for One and the League of Villains, visitors had never been in shortage, never mind Enji's own opinion on the matter. Hawks had often dropped by, almost always running his mouth off about something or the other. Enji had let him, if only because he would have been blind not to have noticed how the boy's smile had turned brittle, dark circles under his eyes growing more pronounced as the years went by, the stress of number 2 and the fallout from the revelation of his double agent status taking its toll. It's strange to realize that right now. Hawks must be barely over 2. Shoto visited sometimes. Never for long, and always professional, not that Enji would have had it any other way in an official setting, but it had been jarring back then, the sudden realization that his interactions with his own son were more stilted than with an effectual stranger. Add in the increased number of staff, police and smattering of other pro-heroes, and the foot traffic had grown quite ridiculous at some point. It's not that he misses it, heaven forbid, but it might be true that certain elements of this backslide were better before, not after. Enji sighs, trying to shove those thoughts to the back of his mind and focus on the papers in front of him. The problem about traveling back in time is that all his current cases are ones he's dealt with before. In the span of half a day, he's reviewed the material and his memories to compile the information he needs. Some come much easier to him than others. The drag dealing ring, he vaguely recalls. The serial kidnapper turned murderer, he definitely does. Enji presses his lips together. This time around, he will make it in time. Of course, it would be suspicious to send his input back to the police so quickly, all at once. But once he finishes planning out his schedule for sending and settling the cases, that leaves him with nothing to do. Enji briefly considers an impromptu patrol, but his mind keeps drifting back to Shigaraki, to All for One, to the army of Nomu and the League of Villains. Right now, they're All Might's problems. Not his, not Shoto's, not All Might's successors. It had been obvious, in the end, once Deku had started using quirks he shouldn't possess, quirks that anyone who did some searching realized belonged to a series of mentors and mentees. It was amazing that no one had realized it sooner, the pattern of inheritance of that particular strength enhancement quirk, but then and again, none of the previous heroes had been anywhere as famous as All Might. Enji could just ignore all of it. He's 2 decades early. Development of Nomyu should not have begun. Shigaraki hasn't even been. Enji pauses, instinctively reaching behind him to grab a file, only for his fingers to close around thin air. Right. 20 years too early. 20 years to prepare, in advance. Enji had always been terrible at being a bystander. It's a seasonal flower, and we only have the dormant bulbs right now. Even with our MSDR's quirk, it'll take another couple of weeks to bloom. Do you have a particular species in mind? We have these few. Settling into their new routine is a matter of relearning some old habits, dinner at home, even on weekdays, having a young child in the house again, and forming new ones. Rei's pillow is now a permanent fixture on Enji's bed. Enji is a bit less of a permanent fixture in the dojo. There's some ramifications of this whole time travel thing that he doesn't like to consider. The fact that he's technically almost twice Rei's age is the most discomforting. Yet, Enji has to admit being 20 years younger has its benefits. Right now, he's at his physical prime, his agility and stamina honestly much better than it will be. He'd made up for it in the future, past. With stronger technique and quirk control, the knowledge of which he's brought back with him. Granted, he'll have to train to stretch the limits of his flames and bring his endurance back up, but he's definitely in a much better place than he first was at this age. It shows in Wednesday's raid of the Drag Ring, a collaboration with Gran Torino that goes very smoothly. Enji receives a rare compliment from him. It's just as well he can get away with a short thank you and a nod, because it's hard to muster anything beyond that when he's trying not to think about the last time he'd seen his ex-teacher, an ill-fated showdown with All for One that could only have ended one way. It shouldn't even have been his fight. Enji should have known that things never stay straightforward. As far as quirks go, this villain's is simple, but effective. The ability to transform one's nails into sharp blades has obvious applications. Last time around, the investigation process had seemingly tipped him off. He'd gone on the run. By the time they had arrested and interrogated him for information about his victim's whereabouts, it had been too late. Enji still remembers. 7 corpses in the basement, dismembered, drained, frozen in ice. This time, he's pushed the investigation timeline up by 2 weeks. When they storm the villain's house, he isn't prepared. But none of them, least of all Enji, expect a villain whose MO and previous capture exemplify cold, logical and psychopathic to snap in such an emotional way. Instead of running, the villain goes for self-immolation. It's a cheap attempt to take the entire house and his hostages with him. Enji dives straight in. Fire and flames are Enji's bread and butter. By all accounts, it should have been a complete victory. It isn't. The casualty count is much lower, but it's still 2 deaths too many. He's quite sure these 2 women died the earliest the last time as well, according to the coroner's report. There's something about that disturbs him beyond the ball of frustration and guilt in his chest for having failed again. He's not sure which is worse, if their deaths were somehow scripted, or if it's just a coincidence, living proof, not living. Enji thinks with an edge of hysteria, that he still isn't good enough. Debrief is a somber affair. No one blames Enji. They cite that no one could have known that at least he'd managed to rescue the other 5 in time. Enji thinks that they probably would have, if they knew. The pit that settled at the bottom of Enji's stomach grows more cavernous with every step he takes towards his house, a piercing sort of frustration that refuses to ebb. 1 foot into the dining room, and both Rei and Tuya turn to face him mid-conversation, halfway through their meal. They are smiling about something or the other, and it should be easier to take his seat at the head of the table as he has for the past week, to let inane conversation and nursery escapades quell the hurricane raging in his chest, but it isn't. Sometimes, he still wonders if they really are better off without him. Enji turns and leaves. He thinks that Rei calls after him. It's hard to tell past the pounding of his heart in his ears and the slam of the door. The moment he reaches the dojo, he props an arm up against the wall. He closes his eyes for a few moments, trying to shake away the scarlet haze clouding his vision. It doesn't work. He thought he'd got better at it, at getting a handle on his temper, but he's on edge, and it's bad enough when he's angry with someone else, but it's always been worse when there's no clear target, and part of it is directed at himself. He makes for the punching bag and starts pummeling it. There's something about the mindless repetition that he relishes, the way the abrasion of leather on skin numbs the sting of his failure. He's stronger than he was at this age. His body isn't used to it, but his mind is, and it takes more effort than it will, but he can. The point is, he's so much stronger, has so many more advantages, and it's still not enough. Enji forcibly unclenches his fists, staring at them for a moment. Can he? His frustration fuels his recklessness, it always has, and he shouldn't be pushing himself right after work, but he needs, to prove that he can. His fingertips tingle in anticipation. Enji concentrates his hellfire there, orange fading into luminous white. The strain of sustaining it sets in, but he holds on, feeding it, until he's at his limit. When he lets go, his flames shoot outward, a network of beams that isn't as extensive as it will be with practice, but his control is there, the firepower is there, and it slices through the dummies like butter when he flicks his wrists, directing the flames just where he wants them to go. For that one moment, a surge of visceral satisfaction courses through him, the loud clang of metal clattering onto the floor behind him, and then, there's a gasp from the doorway. Enji twists around sharply. Rei is at the doorway. Luckily, Tuya isn't. He tenses. He feels the signs of overheating set in. The throbbing in his temples, the tightness in his chest, the sudden sense of vertigo as if the floor's being pulled out from under his feet. He's done more damage before, both to the dojo and himself, but that doesn't mean he wants his wife to see any of it. Not this time. Not the violence Enji's capable of, quirk-related or otherwise, not his weakness during the aftermath of overexertion. Their gazes meet, something magnetic in the way their eyes snap to each other's. There's tension in the stiffness of his posture, in the tight grip of her fingers on the door frame. Is this going to undo all of the progress they have made since then? How long have you been there? Enji asks, lower and harsher than he'd meant. Accusation and aggression have always been his go-to defense. Rei's hand drops to her side, but her gaze doesn't, and she makes to speak. Enji braces himself in anticipation of her answer, trying to ignore the heaviness of his limbs. He needs to sit, or at least rest his weight against a surface, but Rei is here, and Enji pauses, a moment of ugly clarity. Even now, his pride is in the way, isn't it? I only saw your last move. Rei says. She sounds unsure, but her voice doesn't tremble. Doesn't that take a lot out of you? Enji blinks. Yes. He says slowly. The knot in his chest loosens by a fraction, a vague sense of relief that she hasn't ran away, although a part of him still wishes she would leave. Rei approaches him carefully, as if he's a cornered animal she doesn't want to frighten, and how ridiculous is that? He's the one who's just sliced up a dozen titanium-reinforced dummies in a fit of frustration. There's a warning written in the hardness of his gaze. He doesn't expect Rei to disregard it, but she does, inconceivably reaching a hand out towards him. It's a mix of the sincerity of her expression and Enji's own self-inflicted lightheadedness that he just stands there, keeping his eyes trained on her, and lets her press the back of her hand against his forehead. It's just a light touch. There's barely any pressure to it, but it's refreshingly cooling against his blistering skin, and for one insane moment, Enji nearly gives in to the urge to catch her hand when she retracts it, and continue pressing it there. You pushed yourself too hard. Rei's tone is lightly scolding. I'm not a hypocrite. Enji says, and Rei looks at him, concern bleeding into confusion. Ah, right. No context. Wrong, Rei. It's just overheating. He continues more firmly. I will be fine with rest. Rei looks doubtful. She bites down on her lower lip. I can help you to cool down. She suggests. Enji's instinctive response, one that has been his modus operandi for years, is to snap that he's fine, make her leave, and then sink onto the floor to deal with it alone. But instead of that, he catches himself, biting his tongue and swallowing his pride. How? Rei's eyes widen. She hesitates for a moment, then takes a tentative step towards him, getting into his personal space. Oh. I'm filthy. Enji feels the need to point out. I can take another shower. Rei says, a slight twitch of her lips. There's an element of awkwardness to it, at first. Enji has never been one for hugging. Rei lightly presses herself to him, activating her quirk. She's encouraging in the way that she holds him, resting her head against his chest, and Enji gives in, solidifying the touch by wrapping his own arms around her shoulders and back. It still feels like he's burning from within, but the coldness brings physical relief. The direct contact isn't all, Enji realizes. There's a layer of frost creeping along the window sills, the air in the room notably cooler than it was before. Subtle, compared to Shoto's ice walls. Her touch is gentle, but Enji feels raw. Exposed. It feels strangely natural, but they've woken up holding each other more often than not in the past week, and so maybe that's not as surprising as it could be. Shouldn't you be afraid? Enji asks, a barely audible murmur against the top of her head. That you have good quirk control. Rei asks, tilting her head to look up at him, her tone deliberately innocent, as if she doesn't get what he's asking. Enji doesn't understand. Just 1 week ago, he'd touched her carefully, and she had tensed up like a sprig of mimosa. Now, he's exhibited what most people would consider violence, and she's initiating contact. They just stand there in silence while he recovers, and just when Enji is considering pulling away, Rei speaks. What happened? She asks, a soft, slightly halting question that makes Enji stiffen. I failed. He states. I don't want to talk about it. He'd hoped she wouldn't ask. Rei's eyebrows pinch together to form a frown. But you've been the number 2 hero for years. How just forget it? Enji snaps, wrenching himself out of her hold. Rei nearly stumbles. She flinches, subtle but it's there, and it feels like a punch in the gut. Of course, it's not that she's suddenly fine with it all, it's just her own way of trying. The edge of his anger evaporates abruptly, the slow burn of shame and guilt surging up in its stead. Enji can't fail here too, not when he's already failed as a hero. I'm sorry. He grits out. It's fine. Rei interrupts, soft but firm. Enji blinks. She just cut him off. In the middle of an attempted apology, no less. I should have made myself clearer as well. I didn't mean to imply don't make excuses for me. Enji scoffs. I overreacted. I think you're just being too HRD on yourself. Rei counters, her tone somehow patient, and this entire exchange is getting ridiculous. Enji presses his lips together. What's your point? It's just... Rei pauses, and it's either the earnestness of her confusion or the way she's obviously striving for tactfulness, a courtesy he had never afforded her, that causes his planned interruption to die before it leaves his lips. I don't need to hear the full story, but how was this time different? It's true from an outsider's perspective that it seems to be business as usual. He's been in the thick of things for almost 10, over 20 years. He's seen plenty, failed people despite his best efforts, and Rei knows it. But how is he supposed to explain that he's encountered the same villain before, that there's no excuse for him being unable to do his job properly the second time around? I'm in a better position to respond now. Enji says slowly. After so many years, I should be able to spot the patterns. Rei doesn't respond immediately. She twists a lock of hair around her finger as she looks to the side, seemingly considering his words. There's always going to be an element of uncertainty. What matters most is doing everything in your power, right? Rei starts. If what you said were true, veterans like Crimson Riot should have a 100% success rate by now. The kindness of her tone hurts more than the harsh truth in her words ever could. Maybe you shouldn't be relying so much on trends. She suggests, almost as an afterthought. Why not? Enji raises an eyebrow. Inductive reasoning might not apply well on human behavior. People are full of surprises. There's a slightly wistful undercurrent there, the sense that it's a loaded statement, and suddenly, Enji isn't quite so sure what they're talking about anymore. Before he can reply, his stomach embarrassingly, maybe fortunately, chooses that moment to growl. Ray hides a smile. I saved you dinner. Enji clears his throat, ready to accept the subject change. Thank you. It sounds empty and insincere, reminiscent of the thank you for your questions he occasionally uses during press conferences. Ray doesn't seem to mind. She smiles in response, and it's Enji's own impulsive need to prove his standards, and her expectations for him, shouldn't be so low that fuels him when he leans in. Their breaths mingle for one long moment. He sees something flash in her eyes, permission, maybe longing, not fear, and so, he presses his lips to hers. 20 years. Her lips go from parted and shocked to soft and receptive. It isn't as familiar a sensation as it maybe should be, they never were that kind of couple, and so, it's an even mix of remembering and learning when he deepens the kiss. Her arms wrap around his shoulders, a gentle, grounding pressure, unlike the unexpected undercurrent of urgency with which she's responding. He takes her cue, slow, insistent slide of tongue against tongue, and he's not sure how long it lasts before they pull away. Only that it was far beyond what he'd planned, and possibly, what has ever been. He's never really missed the physical aspect of it all, but it's much better than he remembered. Or maybe, he can simply appreciate it more this time, an act, rather than a tool or a means to an end. Ray looks as surprised and breathless as Enji feels when she looks back up at him, a rosy flush on her normally pale cheeks. He can't help thinking that this, whatever it is, will do. Enji had picked a different species from the last time, based purely on name, and admits that maybe he should have done more research. But how was he supposed to have known amaryllises could look so different? The flowers in the bouquet are painfully ostentatious. Appealing, perhaps, but in a loud look-at-me, attention-grabbing kind of way, candy stripes of red and white and an overabundance of petals. Enji looks ridiculous carrying them. He's quite sure that this isn't Ray's style. It's certainly not his. The moment Enji gets home, he shoves the DMN thing into her hands. You weren't specific enough, he says accusingly, without any preamble. Ray's surprised gaze slides from him, to the flowers, then back up to him. The beginnings of a smile plays with the corners of her lips. I didn't think it would be relevant, she says, a strange mix of confessional and playful. He's heard her speak to Tuya like this before, but it's never been directed at him, and Enji can't help realizing, with a jolt, that he much prefers it to stammers and wary politeness. Why else would I ask for your favorite flower? Enji grumbles, no real heat in his voice. It's been years. There's a real smile on her face now, a teasing lilt in her voice. Would you have remembered a scientific name? Of course, Enji scoffs. I have a good memory. What are 6 years, compared to 26? I'm curious about which you'll pick. Ray says, and it takes a couple of seconds for him to realize the implications. Enji gives her an aghast look. Do you expect this to become a regular affair under the guise of a guessing game? I'm kidding. She giggles, and it's a short chime of laughter that he should, at best, be able to indulge, not find so captivating that he wants to hear it again. Besides, it's not like you'd need that many tries, right? Privately, he thinks that he wouldn't mind taking more tries to figure it out, if only to bask in the warmth of her contentment. It doesn't help his case when Ray stands on the tips of her toes, kisses him on the cheek, and whispers thank you. Part of him wonders what the original, future, Ray's reaction was. Likely more measured. Perhaps she had even thrown them away. Not exactly how he'd planned it, but reluctantly, Enji considers it a win. Chapter 3. Ray had been telling the truth all along. She doesn't play favorites. General flower shape aside, it's the diversity that appeals to her, the sheer number of variations on red and white, the motif she's come to associate with their family, that the genus is capable of. The fact that he remembered even that much means much, much more than the exact appearance of the flower ever could. There is a crystal vase in a cabinet that hasn't seen the light of day for far too long. She places the flowers in them, then rests a hand on its base, using her frost to cool the water down. Ray is happier now, really, but she can't help the niggling sensation of doubt that creeps up on her sometimes, an ever-persistent shadow at the back of her mind. Somehow, it's the littlest things that are the most jarring. Her husband has never been one for grand overtures of romance, but that just means that every small action says all the more if you know how to look. Years of practice have trained her to read into things that others would miss, the active decision to stay in the same room after eating instead of immediately excusing himself. Wishful thinking, some would say, but maybe not, and Rei has always kept faith. So, it's the seemingly unwitting things, lacking their usual purpose, that catch her off balance. How many times now has Rei looked up, only to find him staring at her? That's something in itself, that he's looking at instead of through her, but the way that he does it, as if she's a puzzle he's trying to figure out with a time limit. That's very new. There's a runaway pack at the back of her wardrobe, hidden behind piles of clothes and art materials. But she doubts she could ever leave, not with Tuya in the picture. Where would she even go? Back to her parents, who were nothing but supportive of this union from the start. To find and burden a brother who has a family of his own. It's clear that Enji is trying. The problem isn't that it's not enough so much so as he's almost too good at it. She'd had her suspicions back on that night, and all that's happened since haven't exactly alleviated those fears. How could a single nightmare, a fictional construct, even if born out of very real fears, have had such an impact? How weird is it of her to have been relieved when she'd walked in on him that day, in the dojo? I know, she knows how the old adage goes, that she shouldn't shoot a gift horse in its mouth. But there's no way she can let herself live a lie if this turns out to be one, even if just about every fiber of her being wants to. When she eventually broaches the subject, it's on one of those nights, strangely domestic in a way Enji had never let himself be before, him reading a book in bed after an evening spent with her and Tuya. She's putting away the laundry when the question falls from her lips. Have you gone for any health checkup lately? Enji goes still, and she instantly regrets. The tactful indirectness does little to dull the impact of her words. It could have been an innocuous question, if not for the timing and context and everything in between. It's the unspoken insinuation that stings the most, the slow twist of a barbed weapon yanked out from a wound, and Enji would know. Does she truly think that he's only capable of all this when under external influences? Enji knows it's irrational. She's trying to look out for him, for goodness sake. But knowing something intellectually has little bearing on his instinctual reactions, and he can't help the stab of betrayal in his chest that, Rei would rather trade him in for his past self, even if he would treat her and their children far worse than he would. God, it sounds so stupid when he puts it like that. There's a problem of tenses somewhere. It's absurd that he's even in this situation in the first place. His eyes follow Rei as she folds the laundry, studiously avoiding his gaze. He shuts his book, page 184, and briefly considers feigning ignorance. It would put her on the spot, a petty form of payback. She would squirm, trying to dig her way back out of the grave, and that's the opposite of what he actually wants. Enji unclenches a fist, taking a deep breath before he speaks. If it were a quirk, would you actually want it removed? Enji's attempt at blasé falls painfully short. Compartmentalization has never been his strong suit, not really, and it shows in the brittle quality of his voice, bitterness leaking through the cracks. Rei inhales sharply, her gaze flitting to him, then drifting back down to her hands. He doesn't like it, doesn't get it. The contrast between this and the glimpses of playfulness he's seen is stark. How can this be necessary if it's just hurting them both? It wouldn't feel right for me to benefit from something like that. Rei eventually says. The last part of her sentence comes out rushed, a barely audible string of sounds. Even if I were happier as well. Enji asks, his lips curling up into a sardonic smile, more sharp edges than anything else. Maybe it's a cruel question, but it slipped out, and something in him wants the answer too much to take it back. Rei's eyes snap back up to his, wide and alarmed, indecision visible in the way she nibbles on her lower lip. But if you're compromised, it wouldn't be real, would it? She asks quietly, then looks away again. Skewed or impaired judgment, you know how it goes. Enji pauses, his tongue feeling like lead, a sort of crushing pressure in his chest. It would be easier if she would stop placing his perceived happiness before her own. And technically, there's no denying that he's a hijacker, a replacement, in some ways. If the problem is just the truth, there's no real problem at all. He's always been sure of what he wants, and right now, compromising is an active choice. So, it doesn't take too much effort to lighten his tone into something more casual, despite the lingering unease simmering beneath his skin. I still feel like me, so that's all hypothetical either way. He says, if only because he doesn't know what else he can claim. Besides, I doubt how I treat my family would have been a priority of any of the villains I've encountered. He adds in a drier tone. Ray smiles, a self-deprecating edge to it that's a far cry from the ones he's starting to grow used to. I suppose not. Don't mind me, I was just being silly. She says with a short laugh. It frustrates him, just a little. He has never appreciated the superficial placations that society is so fond of, nor the second-guessing they entail. It would be far easier if everyone would simply say what they actually mean, and the petulant thought has him stop short. Enji sighs, trying to summon some willpower to spit out what needs to be said. What I mean is, I'm quite sure that this is what I want. He clarifies, slightly stiffly. I can go for a checkup if it worries you that much. A bluff, or perhaps not. It might be worth investigating. Would there be any sign of whatever it is he's been through in a physical examination? No, it's fine. Ray starts, then pauses at his raised eyebrows, a sheepish, but real, smile tugging on the corners of her lips. Although it would help. She admits. So, that's that. In the end, he presses a kiss to the top of her head, she falls asleep in his arms, and it's all far simpler than it has any right to be, even without a full resolution. I want to be a hero too. Tuya says midway through dinner one day, all bright eyes and barely contained excitement. Enji winces internally, but manages to school his expression into neutrality. There are plenty of other career options. But I want to use my quirk for work. Tuya pouts. Want to? Enji corrects absently. Darby uses his flames without restraint, but that's only because he's burnt and broken beyond repair, staples, and stitches all that hold him together. Enji doesn't want to have to watch all of that play out all over again. But what is he supposed to tell him? That there's no way he can be a hero without destroying himself in the process. That he should just focus on other pursuits. That with Xiaotou in the picture, there's no need for Tuya to step up. It's the message he'd sent Fuyumi and Natsuo, the last time around, what with Tuya being there, and then Xiaotou, and he's going to have to figure out how he's going to deal with all of that this time. Enji has never shied away from laying out the truth. But where does giving a child the freedom to choose end, and neglect start? So, would you prefer your father's fire quirk, or my ice quirk? Ray's tone is teasing, and it captures Enji's attention. I don't know. Tuya scrunches up his face, as if it's a momentous decision instead of a harmless hypothetical. Can't I have both? Ray winks at Enji. To his surprise, she activates her quirk right there and then, creating a small rectangular block of ice on the table right in front of them. With a few seemingly effortless twists of her hands that would make seasoned ice carvers weep at the negation of long years spent honing their craft, the ice morphs into a sculpture of a dragon. Enji's no expert, but even he can tell that the level of detail is ridiculous, from the smooth surfaces of its wings to the rough scales of its body. For her finishing touch, she drops a few ice cubes into her glass of orange juice with a dramatic flourish, then casually takes a sip. Considering the limited area, it's a rather masterful display, Enji has to admit, in terms of both technique and style. That's cool. Tuya proclaims, looking completely sold, and that won't do, considering he won't even be getting an ice quirk. Enji shouldn't be encouraging this sort of behavior at the dining table, but he chooses that moment to meet Ray's gaze, and can't help narrowing his eyes at the playful glint of "Oh, can you do better?" practically shining through. Being able to back down from a challenge is not one of Enji's strengths. Showmanship, on the other hand, is, if only because it's an unfortunate cornerstone of hero work. He summons his flames, reducing their temperature to the bare minimum, and sends 3 streams of fire out towards the largely unused candelabrum at the center of the table. On a whim, he keeps to the theme, shaping the flames into 3 intertwined dragons, one for each candlestick. He deftly weaves them around Rei's unnatural durable sculpture in a series of loops, letting each dissipate after its assigned wick is lit. It's possibly the most frivolous thing Enji's ever used his quirk for, childhood shenanigans notwithstanding. He turns to his audience, raising an eyebrow in a "how was that?" gesture. "That's amazing." Tuya cries out, looking unduly tormented. "But if you had to choose?" Rei prompts, a small, amused smile on her face. "I don't know, red ice or white fire." Tuya eventually decides, and Enji nearly chokes on a mouthful of rice. If Tuya's flames were white, it would have been easier. Still beyond the limits of current support equipment, but they would have 3000 kelvins more leeway to play with. Of course, that's only if they go about things from the traditional angle. Enji doesn't realize just how much he's been dreading the day that Tuya manifests his quirk until it comes. In an ironic turn of events, considering how he's actually putting effort into spending time with his son this time, he isn't the first to witness it. "Can you try again?" Rei asks excitedly, ambushing him the moment he comes back from work. It takes every ounce of self-control Enji has not to do something ridiculous like lunge forward and grab Tuya's hands to stop him from activating his quirk. A comically serious expression, and then a wisp of blue flame, flickering for barely a moment, yet definitely not just a trick of light. Enough to cause minor discomfort, not enough to hurt, either in terms of power or duration. "Why's it blue?" Tuya asks, eyes wide, still staring at his hand and waving it around, as if the motion itself, devoid of any intent or purpose, would activate his quirk. Enji still remembers the flash of pride the first time around, when he discovered that not only did his son have flames, they actually ran hotter than his. He'd grinned at Tuya, hoisted him up in his arms, and had all but metaphorically sprinted to find Rei to announce the good news. They'd gone out for dinner that night, him in an uncharacteristically exuberant mood, them rather more bemused and confused, but oh so willing to play along. It had probably been the closest they'd ever been to acting like a normal family. Enji's beginning to understand his own childhood was never all that normal, that he should maybe not use it as a reference standard, but the alternative is going in blind, and that is something that he still isn't sure he can successfully navigate, even with the benefit of hindsight. "It's very hot. Much hotter than mine," Enji explained slowly, ignoring the faint ache in his chest at how happy Tuya seems to be. It's not in his nature to begrudge the universe for anything. What is simply is. The weak-willed whine, the strong make do and thrive. Yet, it's true that Tuya's quirk mismatch is unfair. Wasted potential, insurmountable obstacles, and all Enji had done back then was add fuel to the fire, a veritable cornucopia's worth. "Hotter than yours." Tuya repeats, an expression of awe on his face, as if the idea is beyond his comprehension. There must be another way aside from derbies, and Enji isn't afraid to use every resource at his disposal to ensure it. "Yes," Enji says, hesitating only slightly before ruffling Tuya's hair. It earns him a grin. Should he bring it up now? He doesn't exactly want to dampen their spirits, but will you teach me how to make those dragons? Tuya asks excitedly. Either his ability to appear impassive has deteriorated tremendously, or his wife has learnt to read him a little too well, because when Rei's gaze lands on him, her smile dimmed slightly, a subtle but definitive transformation from warm to worried. Maybe, the learning has gone both ways. It's the combination of that and Tuya's question that causes him to dismiss the idea. Reality can wait a little longer. It'll take plenty of time before you can do something like that. Enji warns. Technically, not a lie. Tuya pouts. That's not a no. Rei points out in a light tone. Tuya nods consideringly, then turns back to face Enji with a look of stubborn determination that is startlingly, and soberingly, familiar. "I'll do it," he announces with gravitas. Rei laughs, hugging Tuya, and Enji tries not to think too hard about how much of a blow it will be to them both when the truth comes out. "Are you still worried about training Tuya?" Rei asks, later that night. Enji tilts his head towards her. She must have attributed his reticence just now to his e-nightmare. It isn't wrong, but there's two dimensions to the problem, and he isn't sure which is worse, falling short with changing his own conduct and thereby falling into the same trap, or watching helplessly while his son grapples with a quirk he can't control and isn't suited for. It's a bit of a balancing act, and not for the first time, Enji can't help thinking that brainstorming long-term contingency plans to deal with All for One and the League has been, well, if not easier, then at least more straightforward. Somewhat, Enji admits, then deflects before Rei can ask more questions. Blue flames run at very high temperatures. Considering how young Tuya is, we should schedule an appointment to check if his body can handle it, he says, an ashen taste in his mouth. Hindsight, foresight, has never felt more like a curse. Age won't help, not for this. It won't hurt, Rei agrees readily. Are you going to bring him next week when you go to the clinic? Might as well. Enji answers. He can't quite prevent it from sounding slightly hollow. If Rei notices, she doesn't say anything about it. Investor Relations Department. A chirpy voice announces. May I know who is on the line? This is Pro Hero Endeavor speaking. I came across a general request for funding for your research organization. He begins. I see. Sorry, could you hold on for a moment? There's a stilted pause, faint tendrils of a harsh, whispered exchange before the receiver is picked up again. Thank you for your interest, but our areas of research don't include weapons or quirk augmentation devices. Enji nearly snorts. I am aware, he cuts in, that your research focus is the quirk singularity. Correct me if I am wrong, but I understand that you have both theoretical and applied divisions undertaking research on multiple quirks and quirk incompatibility. She pauses. Yes, we do. Are you interested in funding a specific project, or the cluster as a whole? Both, Enji states succinctly. In the vein of a seed grant. The line goes silent for a moment. When she returns, her tone is a lot friendlier. We would be glad to discuss this with you in person. May I check when you would be available to come down to our head office? Enji jolts awake. For the first few moments, there's nothing but a murky haze of fire and destruction and the acrid burn of ash and smoke. There's a bitter tang of BLD in his mouth, the phantom sensation of his limbs being torn apart, and it takes a while for his breathing and heart rate to even out, for all of that lingering sense of horror to fade. Usually, it's nothing debilitating. Decades worth of experience dealing with this sort of thing has its benefits. Most of the time, if this happens, he just rolls over and falls back asleep. But sometimes, it's a nightmare that's firmly rooted in a reality that only he knows, filled with memories of things that will be, or hopefully never be, and it's those which are the most unsettling. Having Rei next to him helps, in the same way that having the knowledge that Tuya is still young and safe, and that too of his children aren't fighting on opposite sides of an effectual war, does. But it also serves as a reminder of how much more he has to lose if he's to fail even while trying, if he has to watch a second time as everything slips through his grasp like sand through his fingers and spiral out of control. And there are times, terrible as it may be of him, that he misses. Some more than others, it's hard not to have favorites, but there's nothing he can really do about that part. Too late, not yet. It's the sort of night where sleep won't find him easily, and Enji knows better than to try. Instead, he ends up making progress on the book he's currently on, Perspectives on the Quirk Singularity Theory, a thorough understanding of which he's going to need if he's to sound convincing next week, assuming things go as planned. It's around half an hour later that Enji feels the pricking sensation of a watchful presence. When he turns to Rei, she's looking back at him, stifling a yawn. Sorry. Did I wake you? Rei shakes her head. The motion is definitely going to tangle her hair. Couldn't sleep? She asks, sounding more alert than expected. Woke up. It happens occasionally. Enji says, tone slightly clipped. Rei's brows furrow. This didn't used to be a problem, did it? She asks carefully, as if she's navigating a minefield, never quite sure if her next word is the one that will set him off. You wouldn't know. Enji says, not unkindly, maybe a little bluntly, but Ray takes it in stride, responding with a non-committal hum. He reaches a hand out to SWCH off the bedside lamp. Does the reading help? Ray asks, instead of going back to sleep as Enji thought she would. To some extent. He answers slowly. Why? There's a beat of silence. How about another form of distraction? Ray eventually asks, an element of uncertainty in the question. What? Enji asks, confused. It is the middle of the night. Ray hesitates. Enji's eyes widen as she makes her intentions known, slowly reaching out to take his hand and place it on her hip. He doesn't move away, and she bites her lip. It's been a while, hasn't it? 20 years. Yes. Enji admits, feeling somewhat like his heart is in his throat. Nervousness, he realizes, and nearly has to laugh. He's far past that stage of adolescence where that sort of feeling should prevail. It isn't performance anxiety, heaven forbid, but there's plenty to consider, and he's afraid of it still feeling like a forced transaction born from ambition and duty, of holding on a little too hard, of breaking her. But at the same time, he realizes he does actually want to, and there's no real reason to put it off. He clears his throat. It's a bit sudden, but if you're sure. Why would I suggest it otherwise? Besides, you've never been hard to look at. Ray smiles almost impishly, lightly tracing a finger over the thin layer of Enji's undershirt, down across the muscles of his chest. Are you seducing me? He asks incredulously. You're my husband. Ray points out, sounding chagrined, and Enji can almost hear her blush, even though it's by all means physically impossible. It's probably that fact, so plainly stated, that makes up his mind. How silly is it for this to be a cause of awkwardness? Something in Enji's mind whispers that it's different, but even so, that's no reason not to. So, before he can second-guess it, he pulls off his shirt in one fluid motion, saving them both from having to elaborate any further. Ray blinks up at him. There's a few long seconds where they both just watch each other, a silent exchange where neither of them are sure what exactly they're saying yes to. But when Enji leans in, Ray meets him halfway, and there's the cool pressure of her lips against his, the tentative touch of her hand on the back of his neck. They have never done slow and languid before, never drawn things out for the sheer sake of pleasure, for what good was pleasure in the grand scheme of things? It is nothing but an indulgence, and the fact that it's so enjoyable troubles him. All of this was for their sakes, not his, but these days, it's getting harder to tell the difference. You should know by now that I'm not made of glass. Ray pulls away to say, slightly breathless, yet with a sense of certainty. Enji stills for a quasi-moment, then resolves himself, solidifying his grip on her waist and shoulder. No, he agrees, letting his lips curve into a smirk. I'd be quite concerned if I were so fond of the taste of glass. Ray lets out a surprised laugh that quickly turns into a gasp, and the sound does things to him, warm heat pooling at the bottom of his stomach. He can't help dipping back down to leave a trail of kisses down her collarbone, and then there she is, falling apart under his touch, not because he's touching her, but because he enjoys touching her, as if that makes all the difference in the world. And maybe it does, because when Ray reaches her CLMX with a gasp, she drags him right over the edge with her, a rush of white-hot intensity that he doesn't remember being half as vivid as it is. He holds her through it, is held in return, and can't help but wonder, is this how it is, then? That was something. Ray eventually says, looking quite thoroughly debauched, trying in vain to arrange the blanket, and Enji shouldn't be amused. It's not like it was even meant to be a joke. But a short laugh manages to make it past his lips, and the blinding smile Ray flashes in return makes him quite sure that it isn't something he ever wants to take back. I think I was lying, back then. She whispers into his skin on another one of those nights, and it takes him a while to place it. When I said I wouldn't want the quirk removed, if it was one. His stomach flops. Still he hums, tracing a path down her neck with his lips. Good, because I doubt my judgment has ever been better. She gives him a faint smile, the kind that reaches her eyes, and neither of them mentions it again. Chapter 4, Interlude. Fuyumi's favorite picture is one that breaks her heart. It's the sort of photo that wouldn't look out of place framed up in the hallway, but instead, she keeps it in her bedside drawer under proverbial lock and key, carefully sandwiched between class photos and notebooks filled with haphazardly scrawled lesson plans. It's one of the few photos left that Tuya is in. He's standing next to her in all of his grinning 8-year-old glory, Natsuo on his other side crossing his arms. Their mother is holding Shoto in her arms, smiling faintly, and their father isn't, but the difference between a frown and neutrality is stark, is enough. Her heart rate goes into overdrive when the news coverage comes in, blurry footage of both her father and Shoto. She's worried for them both, but Shoto's fighting in a team, and Endeavor is fighting alone. Her chest seizes with every hit her father takes, the seconds he takes to get back up increasing each time, and this is worse than the last villain attack, so much worse. Her heart maybe does stop when pyres of blue flames engulf those monsters and her father. The reporter's anxious words fade into a buzzing in her ears, and when the camera abruptly pans away to the heroes coming in for backup, Fuyumi just knows. Her doorbell rings then. She's already crying when she lets Natsuo in. When they hug, she squeezes him a little too hard. The call from Shoto comes in far too late, sounds far too broken, but that doesn't matter. She's just so relieved that she hasn't lost both her father and a brother today. The air buzzes with a sort of nervous energy these days. Villain activity is rising, Rei knows, and she's not sure she wants the details, not when her husband and youngest son are in the thick of things. She knew the risks. She always did. It's a cold day out when her children, all three of them, appear in the doorway, and all Rei can numbly think is at least they didn't get Shoto too. Fuyumi rushes forward to hug her, even as Natsuo narrates the news. Rei's heart is pounding in her chest, glacial cold creeping through her veins, squeezing her lungs, and it's just like the last time with Tuya, a pain that eats her inside out. Fuyumi's fingers are bunched up in her skirt, and Natsuo's hand rests lightly on her shoulder. No one seems to know where to look. Shoto's still standing slightly to the side. He looks lost, frozen in a way he hasn't been for a while. Not in this room, at least. Rei tries to stay strong for them both, for them all, and tries not to think about how familiar that line of tension in her youngest son's shoulders is. The smile she eventually musters is weak. It's all right, you tried your best, didn't you? She couldn't have known, but it's possibly the cruelest thing she could have said. His father's funeral is not grand per se, but it's large, televised, and the turnout is huge. The only part Shoto thinks his father would have really approved of, as of late, at least, is the statement it sends to the villain still out there. He'll have to figure something out for Darby, Tuya, whichever, at some point. It feels like everyone is here, his mother the only exception. He'd been asked to give a speech about Endeavor as a father while Hawks speaks of him as a pro-hero, but in the end, the difference isn't as stark as people might have imagined. Shoto had drafted it with his siblings, and while they don't martyr him, they gloss over the ugly bits, if glossing is a synonym for gross omission. Perhaps, it's how his father deserves to be remembered in death, but it doesn't feel real. It doesn't even feel real that he's gone. Shoto had always thought of him as strong. A fixture in his life he never really knew what to do about, but once whose permanence was all that mattered. Just like that time with Gran Torino, many pro-heroes are present. This time, his former classmates are counted among those ranks. He's tempted to find them, but instead, he stays with Fuyumi and Natsuo, the three of them sitting solemnly in a row in a color Shoto associates with Darby and death. It doesn't really get any better when the main program ends, and the mingling begins. Shoto makes the rounds, accepts condolences from strangers he's never met, nods numbly as he listens to their stories, a hobbling granny who narrates how Endeavor defeated a villain who'd barricaded himself in their office building back in the day, a younger woman telling him how she'd thought she was going to die on the streets when Endeavor had swooped in, carrying her away from the chaos on the streets during that Nomu attack. Shoto is unfailingly polite. He repeats endless variations on how he's glad his father managed to help them, and he just thinks of a forbidding dojo, of shouting and boiling water, of tell them I'm sorry, and I want to be a hero you can be proud of. Would it have turned out differently if he'd put his foot down and stayed? Would Izuku and the rest have defeated All for One anyway? There's a lump in his throat, and Shoto has to excuse himself. His legs end up taking him to where he last saw his classmates. It's not as foreign a sight nowadays as it once was, but the memory of the three of them interning with his father come to mind. It feels like a lifetime ago, back when they were younger and the stakes were honestly lower, even though they were in over their heads, perhaps still are. Bakugo takes one look at his face and scowls, albeit without any real bite to it. He pats Shoto's shoulders none too gently, then beats a hasty retreat, leaving him with Izuku. There must be something in his expression, because Izuku doesn't say anything. Instead, he reaches out to draw Shoto into a hug. Shoto appreciates the gesture, although he endures it slightly awkwardly, not quite sure where to place his hands. That was a good speech, Izuku says when they draw apart. Shoto nods in acknowledgement. Fuyumi and Natsuo helped. The DLVRY as well. Izuku clarifies, giving Shoto a knowing look tempered with a splash of hesitance. Are you all right? He asks worriedly. Shoto's barely begun contemplating his answer when Izuku slams a palm over his forehead. What am I saying? Everyone knows that's the worst question to ask anyone who has a reason to not feel okay. Some things don't change, and Shoto's surprised by how much he hopes they never will. He relaxes just the slightest bit, some of the tension in his posture bleeding out, and Izuku's answering smile when he notices is sheepish yet genuine. So, what are your plans after this? Shoto asks, changing the subject. Izuku looks around as if to make sure no one is eavesdropping. I might be going to America and Island for a bit with All Might soon. He's worried that it'll be like the last time around with All for One. There's a horribly weary look on Izuku's face that takes a few seconds to smooth out. I don't mind the change of scenery though. It's all been getting a bit. He waves his hand, gives a small grimace. I'd be tempted to as well. Shoto pauses, dropping his volume, and sighs. They wanted me to take over Endeavor's agency. He admits. Izuku's eyes widen. Will you? I haven't decided. Shoto looks back down at his fists. They're much less scarred than Izuku's. He's even younger than when his father started the agency. It may look good to the public, but is a family legacy even something he wants? There's no rush. Izuku decides firmly. His eyebrows dip with concern. You look like you need some time off as well. I don't. Shoto says automatically. Izuku gives him one of his patented gentle, disbelieving looks. I just think you could probably afford to have that meal with Momo and spar with Kaken. Have you been spying on me? Shoto asks, slightly bemused against all odds. No. It's just, they told me just now when I asked around. Izuku trails off, flushing, and Shoto nearly manages another smile. It's not right, he thinks, that it's not nearly as hard as it could and should be. Yet, that, in turn, leaves an ashen taste at the back of his throat. I think they need it too. Izuku adds, quieter this time, and Shoto contemplates that even as his friend's tone lightens again. Besides, I've always found fighting Kaken strangely cathartic. Shoto actually agrees. There's nothing like overkill, right? He nods slowly. I'll consider it. The worst part about remembering Enji, Ray thinks, is that it hurts in many ways. Dread-fueled fear from remembering the pain, most of it at his hands, the serrated edge of grief that's carved out a home in her chest, and the simple ache of having loved and lost, striking at the most unexpected of times. Those few, sweet memories are the ones that hurt the most. Maybe it would be easier to just dwell on the bad, but her thoughts inevitably drift to the vase of amaryllises, and then she can't help thinking about what has been and what could have been. It's just... Ray had always thought their future, if they had one, would be a question of her readiness. Not his existence. It's another week later that Shoto finally gets back around to filling up his social calendar. Time marches on, he knows, but dealing with the fallout eats up plenty of it in itself, and there's still regular hero work to be done. There's something about scheduling a borderline illicit sparring session that has a nice ring to it. Granted, Xiaotou isn't exactly sure why there hasn't actually been any fighting. Perhaps it's the weather. It's dark and cool and windy, and something about that puts Xiaotou in a pensive mood. The fact that he's currently on the roof of a long-abandoned mixed office warehouse building doesn't help. Something about its layout reminds him of another of the fights they'd had clearing a Nomu storage location. I came here to fight, not watch you stare at your hand. Bakugo finally breaks the silence, and that just about sums up their current situation. Actually, it's pretty surprising that Bakugo's just let him just stand there for 15 minutes in the first place. I was just thinking, the flames always felt like our most tangible connection. Xiaotou begins without any preamble. If you're having a full-blown life crisis, I'm out. Bakugo warns, even as his voice drifts closer from behind Xiaotou. I'm not. Xiaotou says. I was just making an observation. Sure. Bakugo deadpans. Why the F are you telling me this and not Deku? That's a good question, actually. There's still 3 more days before Izuku's flight out, and he knows Izuku would drop everything to come hear Xiaotou out if that's what he needs, but that's not the point. He has enough on his plate to handle. Xiaotou answers after a long pause. Bakugo splutters. Like I don't. He does, but everyone does, nowadays. I'm saying you can handle it. Xiaotou offers virtuously. Bakugo scoffs, which years of experience has taught him is practically a cue to continue. You know how he was, Xiaotou says, looking back at the view. And how I am. It was like that until the very end. Maybe I should have told him I was proud. Xiaotou pauses. It's even true to some extent, not completely, but it would have been a kindness, wouldn't it? Bakugo just hums in a non-committal way, his arms crossed behind his head as he leans against the railing. It creaks ominously. Xiaotou holds on as well, absently leaning his weight backwards to balance it out. It feels strange. Xiaotou continues, looking at his fingers. He'd spent his childhood wanting to be his father, the next few hating him. I've spent the last few years making the flames my own, but at the same time. Xiaotou trails off, not quite sure of the point he's making. Is it weird that after all the fuss he's made about that, a part of him now wants to hold on to it as the strongest link he's ever had with his father? It's not even just in the most literal sense of genetics. Questions about how to control his flames, after all, have probably been responsible for over half of their non-perfunctory interactions. Bakugo sighs aggravatedly, but there's no real heat in it. That's been a trend more often than not. Whatever you're thinking, does it matter? Xiaotou blinks at him. Not really, I suppose. Bakugo crosses his arms, giving him an unimpressed look. Look, half and half, I don't know if I'm getting it right with your cryptic bullshit, but honestly. He shrugs. You two were probably too fixated on what you wanted to tell each other to have even missed what you didn't hear. Wow. Harsh, but probably true, and if it's true for Xiaotou, even now, it was probably even more acute for his father, who'd had a barely anything fraction of the time. It's both sobering and weirdly comforting. Go mope with Deku if you're having some identity crisis with your quirk. Bakugo continues dismissively, which is valid advice, Izuku would know, even if he doesn't plan on acting on it. You know, you're surprisingly nice to talk to about this kind of thing. Xiaotou remarks. He's partially expecting a tirade on backhanded compliments, but all Bakugo does is roll his eyes and scowl. You're just dumb. He says bluntly. Are we gonna fight or not? It is long overdue. Xiaotou admits. And I did promise, even if I was mentally incapacitated at the time. Bakugo snorts. It's not my fault you decided to match Yarashi drink for drink. A corner of Xiaotou's lips quirks upward in spite of himself. You goaded me because you wanted to see me miss-aim when setting our death from above's on fire. Bakugo smirks. And you did the world a service incinerating his portrait. Xiaotou sniffs. That was partly on purpose. He lies, making use of the moment to send a stream of flames straight at Bakugo, a laughably simple attack he knows won't beat his fellow pro hero's reflexes even at close range. It does mean, however, that Bakugo has to launch himself into the air with a loud crack. Oops! Shoto says unrepentantly. Final fly, Bakugo grins, with that same manic edge to it as always, and Shoto has to lunge to dodge a rather nostalgic, straightforward blast. Maybe we should move this inside, Shoto suggests. The last thing neither of them needs is to be caught. Bakugo's answer involves an unnecessarily complicated series of half tackles and close-range attacks forcing them both back down the fire escape. The familiar pattern of a friendly, probably excessive spar begins, and there's something about the pace that is cathartic, something about using his quirk in a non-life-or-death situation that feels right. There's still a strange, maybe not so strange, pang in Shoto's chest at the bright glow of orange, at unlearned techniques that have gone with his father. Yet, he can't help but think that maybe, things really will be all right after all. If there is an afterlife, Rei hopes that both Enji and Tuya are there, and hopefully, they're getting along. Fuyumi and Natsuo, even Shoto, drop by more regularly nowadays. Even if it's just a transient affair born out of worry for her mental and emotional state, it's nice. Darby isn't suicidal, which is to say, he spends the first few weeks after All for One's defeat lying low. But the wanted sign hanging over his head is never going to disappear, and once the official manhunt is over, he figures it's time to resurface the slightest bit. Resisting the siren call of danger. Never his thing. Searching Hawks out is an obvious mistake, but what's his life anyway but a series of those? What Darby gets when he lets himself in is a far cry from the Hawks he saw on the televised screening, put together and glowing with firm resolution. There are bags under his eyes now, the slump in his posture more reminiscent of broken than relaxed. It's pitiful. You know, I still don't get why you idolized him so much. He was a real BSTRD. Darby drawls in greeting, and Hawk stiffens, only just now noticing his presence. Even more tired than he seems, then. You know that I know worse. Hawk says after a beat. Darby shrugs. He'd beg to differ, but he isn't here for a childhood pity party. Well, he certainly liked you more than he did me. Darby concedes with a sardonic smile. Though, who knows what he'd have said if he knew you were F me. Hawks' fingers jerk to a stop on his keyboard, but his eyes are still fixed on his screen. Darby wants nothing more in that moment than to wrench his laptop away, to grab his chin and force his gaze up onto him. You shouldn't be here. Hawks eventually says. Slightly testy, yet far too mild for Darby's liking. No, Darby agrees, giving Hawks a slightly unhinged smile. And you shouldn't be letting me stand here. Nostalgic, isn't it? Hawks presses his lips together. To what do I owe the pleasure? Once upon a time, I swore I'd be the one to put him in his grave. Darby leans against the wall, crosses his arms. Hawk snorts humorlessly. You gotta be kidding me. You're here for closure. Darby laughs, loud and manic. To check up on you, to salvage this, to say goodbye, he doesn't say, never will. So, there I was wondering what the hell I should do, when you came running onto the scene with your minions like a madman. Hawks' jaw tenses. He flicks his laptop shut in a sharp motion, and finally, looks at Darby. I was too late. Hawk says, emphasis on tie, and there's no pretense of it being anything but an accusation, the first real crack in his mask of indifference. No more mind games. You don't get to pin this on me. Hawks warns, the glint of hardness in his gaze saying all that his voice doesn't. You had all the time to do something, if you wanted. Unexpected stab of guilt, sharp pinch of regret, a jumbled mess of whos and a whys, funny how it all keeps coming back in full force, and Darby quashes it all down with a sneer and a shrug. At least he got what he wanted to hear. He waves a hand, dismissing the subject as if he wasn't the one who brought it up in the first place. Fine. Then, what about us? An incredulous look. I thought the consensus was that there's no us. Hawks leans back in his chair, casual placidity lined with something cutting. It's the sort of thing that got Darby's attention back then, distrust grudgingly morphing into interest. Sharp edges bleeding through sheepish laughter and snarky apologies, a liar who likes to tell the truth, a hero who did evil for the greater good even when it was tearing him apart. How could those contradictions not draw Darby in like a moth to a flame? Are you telling me you actually believe your own excuses? Darby counters, his lips curling into a mocking smile. Hawks is still staring at him, his mouth a flat, unsmiling line, and Darby thinks wrong, wrong, wrong. He knows how that mouth can look like wrapped around his PP, he knows the filthy sounds that mouth can make when its owner is coming undone. Are you telling me you don't, too ya? Hawks taunts in reply, and this time, Darby isn't caught off guard. That's not fair, Kigo, Darby croons, his words dripping with honey and malice. You're just so much better a liar than I am. Twice never saw it coming, did he? The first time is always the worst, Darby would know. Hawks's feather whistles past his ear like a knife, right where it was meant to go. A fair warning, and one that Darby doesn't heed. I much preferred you when you were playing the stoic. Hawks says, a lie spoken so coldly that Darby nearly believes it. He laughs. Hawks truly does rise to the occasion. It's amazing how someone who claims he wants an easy life thrives so much better backed into a corner. So what if it had been an but move for Darby to dangle the prospect of information in exchange for secretary? He might have set up the catch-22, but Hawks had milked the deal for all it's worth, initiated the second, third, fourth, and who was Darby to deny Hawks's unspoken pleas to forget the BLD on his hands? Darby takes a deliberate step towards Hawks, then another. Hawks's eyes are fixed on Darby's, his brown eyes burning mercurial with something dark and angry, but he doesn't reach for a feather sword, he doesn't back away. 3 steps. Darby should play it safe. Blackened, charred flesh, roasted to a crisp, a familiar sight and smell, what he knows best, and somehow, it's the last thing he wants right now. 5 steps. Hawks should probably be attacking him. But he doesn't, and Darby doesn't stop his approach. Not until they're close enough that Darby can spot the slightest quiver of Hawks's wings, can hear his rough exhale, can sense the precise moment he thinks, F it. It's impossible to say who moves first. There's a hand in his shirt yanking him forward, and his arms snake tight around Hawks's shoulders. Jigsaw pieces with jagged edges, and it's cruel, how well they fit, a tangle of instinct and muscle memory. Darby knows exactly what pressure to card his fingers through Hawks's feathers with. Hawks knows how much Darby likes the rough scrape of teeth on bottom lip. He swallows Hawks's groans greedily, the unspoken confession of no, it wasn't just for the information. Every slide of tongue against tongue screams, and Darby gives as good as he gets, each harsh pull at the base of Hawks's wings an offer of an anchor, every bruising touch an indirect me too. It's when their hips roll against each other's that Hawks roughly wrenches himself away from Darby. Not enough, the sudden gaping sense of emptiness nearly makes Darby snarl. But Hawks's fingers are still wrapped around his wrist and so, he holds back the flames that threaten to spill. We can't. I can't. Hawks gasps, ragged words torn from his throat. Darby thinks blankly. So it's goodbye. I can't keep doing this clandestine sneaking around thing. But you're good at it, I'll do most of it, Darby doesn't say, even as Hawks continues, words spilling out in a torrential rush from a metaphorical broken dam. You're a piece of SHT, and you honestly disgust me. Darby sneers, Hawks plows on, ugly and raw. And I have no clue why I wanna take you places. My grandma's place up north, the old Mesa soba shop down the road, and the cinema with the shitty action flicks. Hawks's voice is almost threatening in its intensity. I want you to show me the bar you said had killer tacos. And I just don't wanna have to look behind my shoulder every DMN step of the way. Darby stiffens, his mind reeling. More than he expected, not what he wanted, and just completely impossible. Getting soft in your old age. Darby asks in the most derisive tone he can muster. Heaven knows he'd been on the receiving end of it enough from him, but it doesn't come out right. Not with that traitorous tendril of something he'd long renounced. Hawks's eyes widen, flash with contemplation, and the roar of Darby's flames under the surface of his skin worsens tenfold, threatening to swallow them both whole. Maybe. Hawks quips, wisely saying nothing that he means. At least, not with his mouth. But his grip on Darby's wrist has turned vice-like, which says plenty more. There's a part of him that wants to use it to drag him in for another round, and therein lays the problem. He wants, he can't. So, instead, Darby looks pointedly at Hawks. Slowly, Hawks pries his fingers off, seeming reluctance. Another paragraph in the DMN essay. Another loud silence, a conversation held in a series of looks that don't say much at all. Guess it really is game over then. Darby raises his hand to wave a careless goodbye. Wait. Hawks blurts out, an abortive twitch of his hand as it falls back to his side. What are you going to do from now? Honestly, who the hell knew? Darby dredges up a smirk. Lay low for a bit, figure something out, I guess. Not like I got many options. Hawks hesitates. There's always turning yourself in. Go back to before or start again. He pauses, his voice growing softer and harsher at the same time. I could say something. Your underestimation gave me a basis for corroboration to mislead them. You knew I was a spy but didn't out me. By the time the rest of the front wised up, you gathered your little group of heroes, and it would have been a complete victory if not for me and mine. Darby deadpans, then gives Hawks a smirk. I'm touched, really, but this was a one-way trip. Who's to say I even want any of that? Hawks opens his mouth to retort. There's something certain in the furrow of his brows that tightens the coil of dread in Darby's stomach. He doesn't want to hear it, and so, he interrupts airily. Besides, number one, no one's gonna forget my pretty face and blue flames anytime soon. It would be Tartarus for me, and you know it. He's expecting Hawks to look torn or mutinous, or even for him to roll with it as a joke, but he just looks resigned. Then I guess we'll see each other around. Maybe. Darby agrees casually as if he's actually planning on it, as if Kigo Tokomi won't just be another set of fading bruises on his arm. This time, when he turns to leave, Hawks lets him. He catches a glimpse of Hawks in the reflection as he sinks down on his couch, placing his head in his hands. A position of defeat even more XPLCT than before his visit. It's an ugly moment of clarity, the cold, bitter realization that that's on him. Hurting the people closest to him, just like father dearest. It's one thing to mess around with someone who is one misstep away from breaking, and another entirely to drag him back to that. Hawks has got an actual future now, however unhappy he seems about it, and it isn't a place that Darby belongs. It's the same with Fuyumi, Natsuo, Shoto, even his mother. It's not like Darby regrets or any SHT like that. But when he gives the window one last lingering look before melting into the shadows, there's a tight pressure in his chest that feels like it's squeezing the life right out of his heart. He wants not the exact same things Hawks does, but stuff like having all the time in the world to reduce Hawks to a breathing, writhing mess beneath him. His nails dig into his palms, even the cheesy dinner dates. A long time ago, he'd sworn he'd have those things. And then, when things had gone to SHT, he'd sworn never to let anyone close enough for it. But this is one of those times it's too late to do anything but pick up the pieces. His father had tried, mostly failed, and as for Darby, karma is karma. He's made himself a little broken bed out of his little broken home. It's high time he slept in it. If there's one thing Darby has always been good at, it's disappearing. I promised myself I wouldn't waste any more tears on him. His mother says. There's a distinctive tremor in her voice, and Natsuo has to look away. Just like the old man to get the last laugh. Natsuo says gruffly, trying for a humor he doesn't quite feel. Faint stab of pain in his chest, not funny, he knows, but what else was he supposed to say? This is Fuyumi's domain, not his. Maybe it's for the best, her mother whispers, but I can't help wishing I could have at least seen him once more. Natsuo knows she'd been preparing for it. He hasn't even forgiven his father for everything, maybe anything, himself. Maybe he doesn't have to and wouldn't have anyway even with more time, but DMN it, this still isn't how things were supposed to have gone. He silently passes his mother a packet of tissues. She accepts it wordlessly, offering Natsuo a wan smile, and neither of them says anything more about the tears streaming down her cheeks. Chapter 5. The results of the tests take 5 working days to come in. Yes, Enji is physically fit for hero work. No, 2E's ice-resistant body isn't compatible with his fire quirk. 2 pages worth of numbers and words, mere black text on white paper. They shouldn't have the power to shatter a child's dream, the same way Destro's ramblings should never have had the power to start a war. He'd stopped by the clinic to collect the results, this time without his family in tow. The last thing he needs is having to field questions on multiple fronts if his situation gets discovered. The last thing he wants is for 2E to have to find out the nature of his quirk by piecing together whatever he can gather from a stranger's somber diagnoses. That said, if Enji had thought that going through this for the second time would have dulled its impact, he was laughably mistaken. This time, he gets to listen to the physician explain 2E's projected limits, while the sounds of dry retching and "I can't go any further" ring in his ears, Shouto's and 2E's voices melding together in cacophonous dissonance. Most of him is shamefully relieved that by the time he gets home and washes up that night, 2E is already asleep. He lingers in his own doorway for a while, watching as Rei adds the finishing touches to an ice sculpture of the Eiffel Tower. She smooths her hand over its tip, and the ice molds itself into a sharp spire. It's a strangely calming scene to observe, even with the way Rei's brows are scrunched in concentration. There's many ways Enji could break the silence. He could launch straight into the subject of 2E's quirk, or perhaps point out how ice sculpting is really much more suited for a desk than a bed. It shouldn't be difficult, really, but somehow, he can't bring himself to ruin the moment of peace. That's nice. Enji ends up commenting. Rei startles, giving him a sheepish smile when she glances at him. Thank you. I'm a little out of practice when it comes to fine architectural details though. He leans in to inspect it. The structure is far more hollow than he'd expected. What he'd thought were simply crosshatches carved into the surface are actually thin needles of ice, arranged in intricate lattices to form the unit cells of the tower. There's even spiral detailing on the lowest arches. Out of practice. Right. Enji raises his eyebrows. And people say I'm a perfectionist. Rei laughs, light and soft, and he nearly decides there and then to leave the discussion he'd planned for another time. I might keep this one around for a bit. She admits, placing it on the table by her side. It seems a bit of a waste to let it melt so quickly. It's a waste in general that you haven't turned this into a burgeoning venture. Enji says. Weren't you the one who told me that would be unfair to the companies making an honest effort? Rei asks with faux innocence, and Enji manages the smallest hint of a smirk. His heart isn't in it, however, and Rei notices. Her attention drops to the stack of papers in his hands. What's that? She asks. It's best to get this over and done with. I collected our reports from the clinic today. Enji admits. Rei's fingers wrap around his arm when he joins her in bed, her grip tighter than usual, and at least that's something, Enji thinks, that they have a usual now. Is something wrong? She searches his gaze, making no attempt at hiding the worry in her own. Somewhat. Not with mine. Enji clarifies. He hesitates for a moment, then offers her the reports. She reaches for them slightly apprehensively, her fingers lingering on his before she lets go to flip through. She freezes when she reaches 2E's portion. This is. She trails off, her face crumpling. The blue flames will be too hot for his body to handle. He summarizes, perhaps unnecessarily, just to fill the silence that's beginning to feel suffocating. Rei doesn't answer right away. Instead, she glances back at her project, seemingly lost in thought. It's one of those times he wishes he could read her mind, but that would be cheating, even more than he already is. When she eventually speaks, her voice trembles. I'm sorry. It's funny how history repeats, sometimes. Enji exhales harshly, his fists momentarily clenching as he lets his memories play spot the difference. This time, he doesn't sneer at her, a flash of disgust at his younger, foolish self, nor storm away in frustration. She doesn't rush after him, and he doesn't turn back only to snarl unreasonable accusations he'd never even truly believed. Sometimes, it feels as if all he really knows is what not to do. Learning what goes in between has been both easier and harder than he'd imagined. This wasn't how combining our quirks was meant to have gone, was it? Rei continues, sounding uncertain, still with that tremor of fear in her voice that he hates, and Enji isn't sure how much of it can be attributed to simple worry about Tuya, if it's just his guilty conscience suggesting otherwise. No. Enji agrees, fighting to keep his own tone even. But we couldn't have known, and it's not like we would have changed our mind if we did. Of course not. Rei sounds horrified at the very suggestion of not having had Tuya. Evidently, his attempts at reassurance need some work. But it's going to be so much more difficult for Tuya than it should have to be. He was so excited. The timbre of his wife's voice is plaintive and imploring, probably the closest he's ever heard it come to bitter, and he isn't surprised that it's from injustice on their son's behalf. Didn't we agree he was a fighter? Enji says slowly, firmly ignoring dark memories of a bright blue burning landscape that prove just how much so. It's not as if it's completely unusable. He points out. We can still figure something out for him. A ghost of a smile. I suppose. She says in a lighter tone. But then, her expression flickers, and Enji decides he doesn't like the way she seems to shrink into herself when she chooses her next words. But also. She pauses, hesitating. What? He prompts. Rei's voice drops to a near whisper. Are you really all right with this? Something in Enji's chest clenches. Do you love him less? Tuya, defective, Fuyumi and Natsuo, failures, Shouto, success, quirk marriage, goal achieved. Conditional love. He'd rubbed that in for all it was worth. That his wife's value lay in her ability to give him his perfect heir, that his children's lay in the power of their quirks. How pathetic was it that it took losing all of that, and so much more before he even recognized their loss, for him to realize that for all he'd convinced himself and everyone else, he did truly care for them on top of all of that. I am. Enji says. There's probably too much force in it for it to count as comforting, but it's more important that it's convincing. I think I'd be fine with it even if he was quirkless. The words slip out before he realizes exactly what he's admitted. He jolts for a moment, reeling slightly from the weight of his own admission, by how much he means it, how much he's needed to hear himself say it. Rei's gaze snaps back to meet his, wide and surprised. Enji clears his throat, but he doesn't look away. Carefully, he rests his hand over hers, and slowly, her lips curve up into a tender smile. Then, I guess we'll just take things as they come. She murmurs. A fatalistic statement he would previously have scoffed at, but he's seen it all once, and he's in no rush. Enji nods slowly. Another moment of hesitation, and then he laces their fingers together, gently pressing the pad of his thumb to her skin in circles the same way she's done for him. Rei squeezes back, and it's her turn to surprise him when she slowly lifts their hands where they're connected, then presses a feather-like kiss to his knuckles. It's a simple gesture. But it feels more NTMT than it should be, laden with significance that Enji can't quite pinpoint, but can't help recognizing. Sometimes, it's strange to think about how far they've come since that first night he returned. The road that lies ahead may be long and daunting, but at least there is a road, and that's all Enji's really asking for. Rei likes to think that there's some things no parent ever wants to experience when it comes to their children. Burying them is at the top of the list, and that's the thought that Rei keeps in mind when they decide it's a good time to tell Tuya. She doesn't like to see her son sad in any form, but there's worse news she could be giving. She's still so afraid for Enji whenever he's in the field, and compared to that, this honestly isn't that bad, is it? Of course, that doesn't make it easy to explain. What's that mean? Tuya asks, and Rei can't help thinking that his confused frown looks a lot like his father's. His gaze settles on his hands, regarding them as if they're a foreign entity from the rest of his body. How will it feel? She tries to imagine it if her ice hurt her every time she summoned it. It's a part of her, a comforting coolness humming beneath her skin. The idea of it ever betraying her like that is unfathomable. She hesitates. Luckily, her husband chooses that moment to take over. He clears his throat. You can still use your quirk, but it might be painful if you use it for too long. That being said, there's a flash of desperate indecision, a split second where he glances at Ray almost as if for permission. Something about that feels wrong, it doesn't suit him, but either way, whatever he sees on her face convinces him to continue. We can practice controlling it together slowly. He finishes carefully. Is he still so afraid of his nightmare coming true? Despite this unexpected twist in Tuya's quirk. Okay. Tuya nods slowly, and this time there's a noticeable wobble in his words. But I can still be a hero, right? Even if it hurts. It's Enji's turn to freeze. His face flickers with that expression that Ray still can't place, of something close to dread that makes her heart ache even more than all it already does for their son. Oh, Tuya! Ray moves forward, bending down to hug him. Tuya all but throws himself into her arms, and she has to kneel down properly to support his weight. She wishes she could just say yes, of course, and then she nearly does, but that's too close to lying, isn't it? Her words are slightly halting when she speaks. It may be difficult, but where there's a will, there's a way. Enji's voice cuts in, this time with an element of calm steadiness to it. It's the same sort of tone he's begun using during hero interviews, usually when he's asked hard questions on what he can do about some new threat or the other, and there's a reason people believe him when he does. Tuya smiles up at them both. It's a watery one. He's trying to be brave for their sakes, she thinks, and she can't help being proud of him even if he really doesn't need to. Ray smiles back, rubbing Tuya's shoulder before looking up to meet Enji's gaze, an unspoken question in her own. She doesn't get the answer she's looking for, but it's an answer nonetheless when his arms envelop them both in a quick hug. He ruffles Tuya's hair and presses his lips to her temple before standing back up. If a backslide ever happens, it's the little things like these that she'll miss the most. Ray pulls away from Tuya slowly, smoothing out the mess that Enji's made of his hair. Do you still want to help me bake a cheesecake? She asks with an encouraging smile. Tuya brightens, nodding, and the weight on Ray's heart lightens as well. Isn't it cruel to give him false hope? Ray asks that night, her voice nearly drowned out by the sound of running water. Enji uses his quirk to dry off the dish she passes him, and a faint puff of steam rises into the air between them. It isn't necessarily false. He says. She might have asked more if Tuya hadn't chosen that moment to rush back in. Quirks and genetics. Despite countless advancements made since the discovery of the first quirk wielder, no one knows for sure how it all began. What were the odds that seemingly spontaneous mutations, at similar loci, would manifest in discrete populations on a massive scale? The biological how was, fortunately, far easier to characterize. Quirk wielders were found to have a specific gene complex on chromosome 21, the diverse yet hereditary nature of quirks attributed to at least 6 known hypervariable regions, 3 from each parent, within it. For all the diversity of quirks, the patterns of expression of their encoding genes rarely stray far from established norms. While any attempts at building a genomic library of all known quirks had long since been dismissed due to the sheer level of genetic polymorphism, it's not uncommon for individuals with medical needs, and the funds for it, to request for chromosome 21 sequencing. Of course, trying to find out how novel nucleotide sequences translate to practical function still remains nothing but a glorified guessing game. It's the main obstacle faced when analyzing quirks that seem to spring out of nowhere, but that isn't much of a problem in Tuya's case. Enji's sequence can serve as a reference standard for comparison. Yet another variation of spot the difference, Enji thinks dryly. We postulate that the differences in these few codons are responsible for the difference in flame temperatures. The project representative says, poking the screen rather enthusiastically. Of course, there's nothing we can do about that part, but these bits that seem to code for fire and ice resistance are more interesting. She closes the long strings of nucleotide sequences and brings up another window, this time showing a zoomed-in diagrammatic representation of a certain segment of each pair of chromosomes. It seems that both ice resistance and fire resistance are co-dominantly expressed, so it's not an either-or thing like we feared. She continues. Enji nods. He already knows this part. Shoto had been living proof. In yours, this particular sequence that should code for fire resistance is repeated over 20 times in each chromosome. In comparison, your son's only contains 8 copies of it in one chromosome. The other prominent repeated sequence, you can see a lot of it in the maternal chromosome over here, is likely to code for ice resistance. Actually, it's rather interesting that the two resistance genes seem to have a similar mechanism. The researcher muses, getting somewhat sidetracked. The third person in the room, a representative from the legal department, looks like he's tuned out. Enji wishes he had the luxury to. The babbling reminds him of Deku, and his past isn't something he wants to think about right now. So, does this mean that conferring sufficient fire resistance would be a matter of increasing the number of copies of that particular gene? Enji interjects as politely as he can. The researcher nods vigorously. That's what we think. It'd be a relatively straightforward matter of copy number amplification, which is well within our scope. The main challenge would be figuring out just how many copies are needed. Ironically, Enji supposes he should be thanking All for One and the doctor who had designed the Nomus. It would never have crossed his mind otherwise to find a solution for Tuya from this angle, not that he'd even really tried at all last time around, Enji admits with a flash of shame. They'd got a definitive diagnosis far too late, and once Shoto entered the picture, the question in Enji's mind regarding Tuya hadn't been, how can I help him? As it should have been so much as how can I sweep him under the rug? Of course, this is all still hypothetical, Mr. Endeavor. The legal department representative tacks on a bit hurriedly, so he's actually been listening after all. The quirk-related gene therapy procedures are in the pipeline, but it'll be a while yet before we can streamline it for more widespread application. And then that's to say nothing about getting approval from the PMDA and QRB. And as Enji knows, there will be politics and ethical issues to grapple with, what constitutes valid medical need. With the unique case-by-case basis this kind of targeted therapy requires, will exorbitant costs hinder all but the richest clients? Of course, Enji has no wish to involve himself in any of those debates. So, all he does is nod curtly, offering a polite smile. Of course. I understand. Thank you for taking the time to explain this. It's a risky game he's playing. But at least, the heightened public scrutiny to come, what with this coming through and that other research lab, should serve his other goal. Public scrutiny backfires in the way Enji least expects. Endeavor's son requires quirk treatment. If you're famous enough, the line between top hero and celebrity is depressingly thin. Heroes Weekly may not be a gossip rag per se, but it comes pretty near it in Ray's opinion. This article's title alone is, after all, hardly the pinnacle of journalism, what with its gratuitous use of interrobangs and blatant speculation. She's glad he's trying to find a solution, but she wishes she could have heard about all of this from her husband, instead of from a tabloid. Thank goodness, there's no mention of Tuya's full name or any details behind the cursory mention of a mismatch. For now, what worries Ray the most is a comment left by someone who'd zoomed in on a seemingly irrelevant piece of information about Enji being involved in the project's funding. The direction of the comment thread it sparked smells like trouble. The fact that it isn't really a conflict of interest won't matter. Ray's heard enough of her father's rants about corporate image and public perception growing up to recognize the sort of thing that can boil into something more serious. If there was one thing Ray and Enji had always been on the same page about, it was the agreement they would keep their family low profile, well out of the media circus. Yet, she looks back down at her phone, the message from her brother still on her screen. Do you two have a plan? Just a few months ago, Ray would have chosen to hold her tongue, to feign ignorance for fear that raising the issue, even, especially, to Enji, would just make things worse. She blinks at the slow realization that all of that isn't what she's going to do. It's something, isn't it? An inside leak. Enji sighs in frustration. It's not like he can really blame the research organization itself for much, aside from poor human resource choices, after the profuse apology he'd received, accompanied by an assurance that the perpetrator had been dealt with. He'd read the original article, of course, but he hadn't expected that Ray would even know of it, let alone ask him about it before he mentioned it himself. Further proof of all he'd missed the first time around, it's still a bitter pill to swallow to be reminded just how much so. Like the rest of their home, the courtyard garden is large and traditional, an open design with well-placed bonsai, a flagstone path leading to a central table. He rarely comes out here, but he admits that there's something tranquil about the landscape. That's probably for the best, considering their current topic of conversation. Ray gives him a faint smile, her gaze flitting from him to the rocks, and then back to him again. Is your agency doing anything about it, then? I considered having the original article taken down, but it was too late by the time it came to my attention. Enji admits. You know how it is when news spreads. Ray hums. An official statement from you could still help to set the story straight. Enji frowns. You want to move our family into the spotlight. His question sounds more accusing than he'd meant it to. Ray doesn't get defensive, she never does. But she holds her head high, and there's something firm in her voice he remembers from long ago, except he'd ignored it back then, and at some point, he never heard it again. Not exactly. She begins. But I don't want Tuya to be considered as some dirty secret of our family. Enji stiffens at that, and I don't like how you're being used as a scapegoat for commentary about social engineering or the privilege of the few. It's slightly alarming how fast his anger can ebb nowadays. He would welcome it more, if only it didn't leave him feeling a bit like an empty husk. The second part isn't entirely unfounded. Enji points out. In the end, it boils down to making the most of the hand you're dealt, and he admits he's got a great one. His machinations may be for a good cause to counter a future threat, but that's hardly information he can spread or even justify at this point. But Ray is right. His family was never meant to be involved in his long-term strategy against the villains, even indirectly. The invasion of privacy regarding Tuya is infuriating, to say the least, and any insinuation that he's ashamed is exactly the opposite of what he wants. Your funds do have to go somewhere, and there's nothing weird or illegal about investing in a cause that's dear to your heart. It's not like the program's scope is limited to Tuya. Ray counters. It sounds unreasonably reasonable when she puts it like that. When did you become an authority on public relations? Enji grumbles without heat. Regardless, he leans against the table and allows himself to seriously consider her point. I don't like it very much either, but this could kill two birds with one stone. Ray adds, quieter this time. Besides, if this narrative continues, it might affect your hero image as well. Isn't it better to do preemptive damage control? If Hawks could handle the derision of almost everyone he'd been fighting for during that year, how can Enji possibly complain about this tiny backlash? Perhaps, but that's hardly worth placing targets on your heads. Enji sighs. Ray blinks, then reaches for his arm. That's probably an exaggeration. Besides, even if it does, that's what heroes like you are here for, right? Enji exhales sharply, and for a moment, his back there staring helplessly at Natsuo, his legs refusing to listen while his brain screamed at them to move. Enji never wants to live through that again. He can't. But just as Shouto and his friends were there then, there's plenty of others now. He'd placed his faith in the future generation of heroes when he died. He can accord that same trust to his contemporaries in this time, can't he? Enji presses his lips together, then sighs, jerking his head downwards. I suppose it's worth a shot. The corners of Ray's lips quirk up, and he thought that would have been the end of the discussion. But her smile doesn't quite reach her eyes, and Enji is more familiar with that flicker of uncertainty in her gaze than he wishes he was. What has he done wrong now? Is there something else? He finds it in himself to ask. Ray threads her fingers together, seemingly struggling for words, which, well, who would have thought she'd be more comfortable discussing PR strategies than whatever it is that's troubling her? It's just, are you really fine with this? A sense of déjà vu. It's amazing how one question can ask such different things. Yes. Enji says after a pause. He pps her head at her, slightly confused. Would you rather I disagreed with you? Well, no, but it's just, this isn't the first time I've observed that it seems like Ray cuts herself off, chewing her lip. I'm just worried that this is turning into some kind of role reversal. I don't want you to be in the position where you feel like you need to please me all the time. I know what it's like to be on that side, and she takes a deep breath, rushing her next few words. I may have been scared then, but that's not how it is anymore. So, you don't have to keep feeling guilty about it. Her words feel like ice-cold water trickling down his neck. Ray's tone grows even more gentle and understanding. Even if you actually did all the things you did in that dream, no. Enji swallows. It comes out hoarser than he wishes it did. He'd prefer not to engage in this turn their conversation has taken, but if that's true, you'd be far too forgiving for your own good. If a tree falls in a forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? Just because no one else remembers it doesn't mean he hasn't done what he has. This Ray can't understand, he deserves it. All the atoning he's trying to do, everything it entails. And yes, Enji's aware that maybe he does crave his family's approval a little too much, that their happiness might just be too powerful a determinant in his perception of success in this lifetime, but what's wrong with that if it's what he wants, if it's for the best? He doesn't quite register that Ray is hugging him until he exhales slowly, and a few strands of her hair tickle his face. He wants to push her away, to pull her even closer, and in the end, he just holds her, his hand somehow slipping into place around her shoulders without XPLCT motor input. Sometimes, it still feels like he's living a lie. The first, the older. Ray would never have held him so tightly. Not before, and definitely not after. That's not really fair to either of us, though. Ray whispers. Don't I get a say? No, because you don't have the full picture. Enji falters, pulling away slightly. He opens his mouth, closes it, nearly wringing his hands in frustration from how hard it is to explain. It's fine. He starts. I'm doing this because I trust your judgment when it comes to our family. Much more than I trust my own. Ray furrows her brows. That's not exactly mutually exclusive with guilt, is it? She softens the edge of her words with a gentle caress of his hand, now resting at the small of her back. Enji sighs, pressing his lips together as he tears his gaze away and just tries to gather his thoughts. That weight in his chest is a firm hand and a guiding pressure all in one. He doesn't think he could, but if he lets go of it, is anything else stopping him from plunging off yet another slippery slope? He's never been the kind to wish for anything as lofty as happiness. Not for himself, nor for anyone else around him. All that he has now is already so much more than he'd ever asked for, and he doesn't deserve it. Not without a healthy dose of guilt on the side. He owes his previous lifetime's family that much, at least, as much as he owes it to this Ray to consider her request of letting go of some of it. She wouldn't ask that of him, if she knew. Now, more than ever, Enji wishes there was a guidebook he could just follow. Your second life, how not to fail twice, perhaps. I'll try to work on that. He eventually says, and it's too vague to be a lie, even if it's not entirely the truth. Ray searches his gaze for a long, fragile moment. Something about the glow of the sunset and the autumn foliage makes her eyes look more brown than gray. As long as you aren't making yourself miserable. How can he possibly explain that watching Ray open up, their interactions colored with less and less trepidation as the days go by, brings him a kind of satisfaction he's never before felt in his life? That the little things that he can do for Tuya to bring a smile to his face are pathetically small compared to the wrongs he'd wrought the last time around. Don't worry. I'm far from miserable. Enji says simply, and he hopes the certainty in his voice says the rest. Okay. Ray murmurs. For those few moments, it's just them and the rapidly darkening sky and the sound of their breaths between them. It's the sort of scene that lends itself to more. It's in the way his gaze lingers on her lips, the way her eyelids flutter shut when he leans in, the way his breath hitches at the simple display of trust. This time, there's nothing awkward about it when their lips meet, no undercurrent of urgency or deep-rooted uncertainty. Just a simple press of lips against lips, and then a not-so-simple sweep of her tongue over his. She tastes like she always does, albeit with a hint of matcha on top. That jolt of realization that he has a frame of reference, multiple, technically, warms his chest in a way that's hard to describe. It's times like this that he can't help thinking reality can wait, and if this is a distraction, so be it. It's dangerous, the sort of thing Enji would never have stood for, and there's some cognitive dissonance there that he can't shake off, but can't quite bring himself to care about either. Rei smiles at him again as they draw apart, her fingers slowly uncurling from their grip around him. She doesn't step away, however, and neither does Enji. His hand still rests loosely against her back when they return indoors, and when he slides the door shut behind them it feels like another step forward.